The dough fought back, a living, stubborn thing that resisted the heel of her hand, with a wet, elastic snap echoing too loudly in the small, steam-choked scullery, where the air hung heavy with the scent of coal smoke and boiling water. Eliza pushed harder until her knuckles cracked against the wooden board, driving the yeast deep into the glutinous mass, while her arms burned with a fatigue that felt less like labor and more like penance for sins she had not committed. Flour hung in the air, a thick, choking fog that settled on her eyelashes and coated the back of her throat with the taste of raw grain, indistinguishable from the dust of the street outside, where the coal carts rumbled over the cobbles of Ormond Street, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of her worn shoes. She worked the mixture, folding it over, pressing down, turning it again, a rhythm she had known since she waxed all enough to reach the table, yet today the motion felt clumsy, as if her fingers had forgotten the language of bread and now spoke only the dialect of fear. "Slower, girl." Mrs. Turner's voice did not shout, but sliced through the humid air, sharp and dry as a bone, stripping away the comfort of the routine and leaving Eliza exposed to the cold scrutiny of the room. Eliza flinched, her hand hovering above the dough, while a dusting of white powder clung to her cracked cuticles like arsenic, diseased skin that no amount of washing could ever remove. She did not turn immediately, keeping her eyes fixed on the rising mound, because she was afraid that if she looked at the mistress, accusation would already be forming in the tight line of the woman's mouth, visible and undeniable as the stain on the apron. "The dumplings," Mrs. Turner said, stepping closer until the rustle of her silk skirts brushed against the damp stone wall, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave that waited patiently for its next occupant. "You took your time with those, far too much time, for Robert says they sat heavy on the stomach before they were even swallowed," turning to lead within him. Eliza swallowed, the dry flour catching in her throat and making her cough a single harsh bark that startled them both and echoed off the wet tiles of the scullery walls. "I followed the receipt, ma'am," she whispered, her voice rough and stripped of the deference she usually lisped so carefully until it shone like silver in the candlelight. "The yeast was slow to rise in this damp. I could not hurry the air nor force the grain to swell before its time." "Damp," Mrs. Turner repeated, the word dripping with a skepticism that felt colder than the draft creeping under the door and chilling the sweat on Eliza's neck. "Is that what we call it now, damp, or is it sloth, carelessness, or perhaps something else entirely that lurks beneath the surface of your quiet demeanor?" The question hung there, unsupported by evidence, yet heavy as a stone, pressing down on Eliza's shoulders until her spine curved under the invisible weight of the implication. She resumed kneading, harder this time, punishing the dough for the accusation while feeling the sticky resistance under her palms and the way it clung to her fingerprints as if trying to pull her down into its depths and drown her in the very substance she sought to master. The scullery was sweltering, the heat from the range behind her baking the back of her dress until the linen stuck to her spine, a cold sweat mingling with the flour to form a gritty paste on her skin that itched and burned with every movement. She could smell the yeast, sweet and cloying, but beneath it lay something sharper, a metallic tang that might have been the lye soap or might have been the fear rising in her own gut, sour and unmistakable as the taste of copper on the tongue. "They ate well enough yesterday," Eliza said, deflecting while her eyes remained downcast, watching the way the light from the high, grimy window caught the motes dancing above the board in a chaotic swirl that mirrored the turmoil in her mind. Mr. Turner praised the suet. He said it was light and delicate upon the palate, just as I intended. "Yesterday is not today, Eliza." Mrs. Turner moved around the table, her shadow falling across the dough and darkening the pale surface until it looked bruised and tainted by her presence alone. "Today they retch, today they burn with a fever that no amount of cold water can quench, and you stand here, covered in the very stuff that made them sick, pretending ignorance while the house burns down around us." Eliza stopped, her hands freezing in the dough and buried to the wrists in the yielding mass that suddenly felt like flesh rather than food. She looked down at her fingers, at the white coating that filled every crease, every scar, every line of work etched into her hands over years of service and devotion to the household. It looked pure, innocent, just flour and just the staff of life that sustained them all, yet under the mistress's gaze, It seemed to shift and gleam with a malignant potential, as if the Arsenic the surgeons would later speak of ways already visible to the naked eye, waiting to be named and condemned by the court of public opinion. "I did not poison them," Eliza said, the words coming out flat and devoid of the pleading tone that might have softened a lesser woman or swayed a kinder heart. "I cooked what was given to me. I used the flour from the bin, the same as always, with no malice in my heart nor poison in my hand." "The same as always," Mrs. Turner echoed, her voice dropping to a murmur that forced Eliza to lean in Tockatchet, a trap disguised as confidence designed to lure her deeper into the web of suspicion. "And yet, the result is different. The outcome is death, or near enough to it. So do you expect us to believe that the flour changed its nature, or that the oven turned against us in some act of divine retribution?" "I expect you to believe I am your servant," Eliza replied, pulling her hands free from Thedo with a wet sucking sound that seemed obscenely loud in the sudden quiet of the room. The mixture clung to her skin, stretching in thin, ghostly threads before snapping back into the mound and leaving her palms bare and trembling in the cold air. "I expect you to know I have no reason to harm the house that feeds me, for where would I go if you cast me out into the streets?" "Reasons are for men walk in courts," Mrs. Turner said, turning away while her silhouette sharpened against the glare of the range and cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. "Here we deal in results, and the result is a familiar thing in pain while you stand her, white-handed and silent, as the grave you are digging for yourself." "I am not silent," Eliza said, though the effort of speaking felt like lifting a heavy bucket from a deep well that had run dry of hope and water alike. "I am telling you the truth, however much you refuse to hear it or believe it in your hardened heart." "Truth," Mrs. Turner scoffed, the sound brittle and sharp as glass breaking on stone. "Truth is what Robert says it is. Truth is what the doctor finds in the bowl. And your truth is merely noise until it aligns with theirs and serves their purpose in this tragedy." Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, but the flour only smeared and created a broader, chalky stain across the grey fabric that marked her as guilty before any verdict was spoken. She rubbed harder, the abrasive cloth scratching her skin, but the whiteness remained, embedded in the pores and refusing to yield to her frantic scrubbing. It was as if the dust had seeped past epidermis into the blood, marking her from the inside out with a brand that no court could ever wash away. The heat in the room intensified, the air growing thick and difficult to draw into her lungs, while each breath became a struggle against the invisible weight of the accusation that pressed down upon her chest. "Venaged." The command hung in the steam, unresolved, until the latch on the scullery door lifted with a click that severed the air between them. Mrs. Turner stepped back into the shadows of the passage, leaving Eliza alone with the dough and the sudden, heavy pressure of a new presence filling the frame. Robert Turner did not shout. He stood within the threshold, his coat dark with the damp of the street, and his hat held low against the brim so that his eyes were hidden in the cast of the shadow, observing the room as a magistrate might survey the scene of the murder before the evidence has been disturbed. The heat from the range wrapped around his legs, but he did not move towards the fire, preferring to remain near the cold draft of the entry where he could watch the girl without offering the comfort of proximity. "Leave it," he said, his voice low and devoid of the tremor that had shaken his wife's tone moments before. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron again, a futile gesture that only spread the white dust further across the grey linen, and stepped back from the board while her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs that she prayed he could not hear. "Sir, I was only I said leave it." He crossed the room, his boots making no sound on the flagstones, and stopped beside the table where the mound of dough sat rising like a pale, breathing thing. He did not touch the mixture. Instead, he reached out and took Eliza's wrist, his grip firm and dry, turning her hand over to inspect the palm where the flour had settled into the lifelines and creases of her skin. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, smearing the powder into a paste that looked too much like the ointments the surgeons used to dress wounds, and he held her there under the dim light of the window while she fought the urge to pull away. "Do you know what arsenic looks like, Eliza?" The question landed heavy, a stone dropped into a well with no bottom. "No, sir, I have never seen it." "It is white." He released her wrist, and she let her arm drop to her side, feeling the weight of it as if the bone had turned to lead. It is a powder, fine as flour and indistinguishable to the eye unless one knows where to look for the grit. He moved closer, invading the space she had claimed as her own, and leaned in until she could smell the ink and paper on his clothes, the scent of his trade clinging to him like a second skin. My children are vomiting blood. Their throats are closed. Their skin burns as though fire runs beneath it. I did not touch any arsenic. The words came out too fast, tumbling over each other in a rush that betrayed the calm she tried to project. I used the bin. I used the suet from the pantry. I have been in this kitchen since 4 of the clock. And yet the poison is in the dumplings. He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs with a precision that suggested the order of his own world was far more important than the chaos wreaking upon his family. It is in the food you prepared. It is under your nails. Eliza looked down at her hands. The white dust remained, embedded in the cuticles, mocking her denial with its stubborn presence. She turned towards the sink, grabbing the rough brush kept for scouring pots, and plunged her hands into the bucket of water standing nearby. The cold bit into her flesh, but she did not flinch, scrubbing at the skin with a violence that turned the water cloudy and thick. She dipped her hands again, reaching for the cake of lye soap, and worked it into a lather that strung where the skin had already cracked from the heat of the oven. Washing will not remove it, Turner said, watching her without intervention. It is only flour. She scrubbed harder, the bristles tearing at the surface until a pinkish hue began to bleed into the suds. It is only flour, sir, I swear it. It is a stain. He turned away from the table, walking towards the door while the shadows lengthened across the floorboards. And stains of this nature do not yield to water. They require stronger measures. Eliza did not stop. She could not stop. The need to be clean, to be pure, overrode the pain shooting up her arms as she scoured the flesh until the white powder was replaced by the red of her own blood. She rubbed the palms together, feeling the raw friction of skin against skin, and watched the water in the bucket turn a murky pink that mirrored the fever she knew was burning in the rooms above. The lye ate at the open wounds, a sharp, chemical bite that made her eyes water, but she kept scrubbing until the brush slipped from her grip and clattered into the pail with a sound like a bone dropping on stone. She held her hands up, dripping, the skin shredded and weeping, and turned to show him that nothing remained but the truth of her pain. The space where he had stood was empty. He had gone without a word, leaving her alone with the dough and the bucket and the silence that rushed in to fill the void he left behind. She wrapped her hands in her apron, pressing the fabric against the wounds to stem the flow, and listened. Above her the floorboards creaked. A door slammed. Then came the sound, wet and hacking, of a body retching over the side of a bed, followed by the low moan of a child calling for water that would not soothe the fire in his throat. Eliza froze, the damp cloth clinging to her palms as the noise repeated, closer this time, as if the illness were descending the stairs like a fog to find her in the scullery. The door to the passage opened again, but it was not Turner who stepped through. It was the constable, his tricorn hat low and his expression set in the grim line of a man who has come to collect a debt rather than ask questions. Eliza Fenning. She nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. You are to come with me. He did not reach for her immediately, waiting instead for her to move, to comply, to accept the weight of the accusation without resistance. There is a room below stairs where you will wait until the magistrate arrives. I have done nothing wrong. The words were a whisper lost in the damp air. That is for the court to decide. He stepped forward, taking her arm with a grip that bruised the tender flesh above her elbow, and guided her towards the door, while the sounds of suffering continued to pour down from the floors above, sealing her fate more surely than any witness testimony ever could. She walked without resistance, her bleeding hands hidden in the folds of her apron, leaving the dough to rise on the board until it collapsed under its own weight. The passage beyond the scullery door held a cold that bit through the thin fabric of her stockings, a damp chill that rose from the flagstones and settled in the marrow of her ankles. The constable did not speak as he marched her forward, his grip on her arm unyielding, an iron band that ignored the raw weeping of her skin beneath the apron wrapped around her hands. They descended 3 steps into the lower hall, where the air grew thick with the scent of coal dust and wet ash, and he stopped before a heavy oak door bound in iron strips that looked more suited to a prison than a home. Inside, he pushed the door open. It swung inward with a groan of hinges that had not been oiled in a decade, revealing a space no larger than a coffin stood on its end. Sacks of coal lined the far wall, black and glistening with moisture, and a single high window near the ceiling offered a slice of grey sky that promised no warmth. Eliza hesitated on the threshold, her feet refusing to move across the threshold, and the constable shoved her shoulder with a flat palm that sent her stumbling into the darkness. "I have done nothing," she turned back to him, holding up her wrapped hands as if the linen could testify on her behalf. "Mr. Turner knows I am honest. Ask him." "Wait here." The man stepped back into the passage, pulling the door shut until only a sliver of light remained, a thin yellow cut across the floorboards. "The magistrate will attend." "But the children are—" The latch clicked, the light vanished. Darkness pressed against her eyes, heavy and absolute, smelling of sulfur and old earth. She stood still, listening to the constable's boots receding along the passage, the rhythm steady and unconcerned, fading until the house settled around her like a held breath. There was no chair, no stool, only the cold floor and the sacks of coal that seemed to watch her from the shadows. She moved towards the wall, leaning her back against the rough brickwork, and pulled her apron tighter around her torso to keep the damp from seeping through her gown. Time lost its shape. It might have been minutes or hours. The only measure was the shifting of the light beneath the door and the changing sounds from the floors above. At first, there was only the house settling, the tick of cooling metal in the range, the distant rattle of a carriage wheel on the cobbles outside. Then the noises began. A door opened upstairs. Heavy footsteps hurried across the floorboards, followed by the sharp cry of a woman's voice, high and frayed at the edges. "Mrs. Turner." She was calling for water, her voice cracking on the syllables, demanding something that no one brought. Then came the retching. It was a wet, tearing sound, violent enough to shake the floorboards beneath Eliza's feet, followed by the low moan of a man groaning through clenched teeth. Robert Turner. He did not shout orders now. He gagged, struggling for air, his breath whistling in a throat that was closing up. Eliza pressed her palms against her ears. The linen stuck to the wounds, peeling away with a soft tackiness that made her wince. "Stop it," she whispered to the ceiling. "Please stop it." The vomiting continued, rhythmic and relentless, a brutal percussion that marked the passing of the afternoon. She could picture them in her mind's eye, bent over the basin, their faces flushed with fever, the dumplings sitting heavy and toxic in their bellies. She had eaten none of them. She had tasted the suet, the flour, the parsley, but not the final mixture that went into the pot. Yet here she sat in the coal dust while they burned from the inside out, and the injustice of it rose in her throat like bile. A key scraped in the lock. The door swung open, flooding the cellar with light from the passage lamp, and Eliza shielded her eyes with her bandaged hands. The constable stood there, joined now by another man in a dark coat who held a coil of rope in his hand. The second man did not look at her face. He looked at her hands, at the blood soaking through the apron, and nodded once as if confirming a suspicion. "Give us your wrists." "I told you." Eliza stepped forward, her stiff legs making her stumble, and she insisted that she had not poisoned them. She was a servant here. For 3 years, she had served this family without complaint. "The magistrate requires you bound." The second man stepped into the cellar, his boots crunching on the loose coal chips scattered near the door. "Do not make us force you." "I will not struggle." She held out her arms, the sleeves of her gown falling back to reveal the shredded skin beneath. "But look at this. Look at what I did to clean myself. Would a guilty woman scour her flesh until it bled?" The constable took her left wrist. The rope was rough hemp, stiff with tar, and he pulled it tight against the raw flesh without pause. Eliza flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth, but she did not pull away. The friction burned, the tar grinding into the open wounds where the lye had eaten the skin away, and she closed her eyes against the sting. "Guilt does not show in the hands," the second man said, looping the rope around her right wrist and drawing it close enough to restrict the blood flow. "It shows in the act. I performed my duty." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the cold that had settled deep in her bones during the wait. I made the dumplings as I was told. I used the ingredients from the pantry. If there was arsenic, it was not from me. Tell it to the judge. The constable finished the knot, a hard lump of rope that bit into her pulse. He tugged on the line to test it, ensuring there was no slack, and stepped back to assess his work. You will be conveyed to the magistrate at Bow Street. Any attempt to escape will be met with force. Eliza lowered her arms. The weight of the rope dragged at her shoulders, a physical tether that pulled her down towards the floor. She looked past them, out into the passage where the lamplight flickered against the whitewashed walls, and thought of the dough left rising on the board in the scullery. It would be overproofed by now, collapsed and sour, useless for any purpose. Will they live? The question slipped out before she could stop it, quiet and desperate. The second man turned towards the door, signaling the constable to move her out. He did not look back. That is for God to decide. They ushered her forward, out of the cellar and into the passage, the rope tight between them. As they climbed the stairs towards the street door, the retching started again above them, a final wet sound that echoed down the well of the staircase and followed them into the night air, sealing her fate more surely than any witness testimony ever could. The threshold felt higher than it had this morning. Eliza stumbled on the stone step, her bound hands useless for balance, and the constable's grip tightened on the rope until the tarred fibers ground into the raw skin of her wrists. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. Pain was a luxury she could not afford here. Move! The command came from the second man, the one in the dark coat who had not looked at her face in the cellar. He stood by the cart, a heavy vehicle with iron-rimmed wheels that waited in the gutter like a coffin on stilts. London night air rushed to meet her, thick with the smell of burning coal and horse dung, a tangible weight that settled in her lungs and refused to be exhaled. She climbed into the back of the cart, the wood rough beneath her skirts, and sat on the bench fixed along the rear wall. There were no windows, only the open back where the crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by the scent of scandal as much as the sight of the rope. Faces appeared in the gloom, pale moons hovering just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Poisoner! A woman spat, the globule landing on the hem of Eliza's gown, dark and wet against the grey fabric. Eliza flinched, but did not wipe it away. To acknowledge it would be to admit the stain belonged there. Look at her hands, a man shouted from the edge of the press, his voice cracked with drink. She scrubbed them raw, guilty conscience, that is. Drive on, the constable said to the driver, ignoring the mob. He climbed up beside the driver, leaving Eliza alone in the box with the second man, who stood on the floorboards near her knees, blocking the view of the street. The wheels lurched forward. The cart hit the cobblestones of Ormond Street with a jolt that knocked Eliza's shoulder against the wooden slat, and the pain shot up her neck like a lightning strike. They were moving. The house was behind her. The Turners were behind her, vomiting bile into their basins, while she was carried away to rot in a cage. The journey through Holborn was a blur of noise and vibration. Carriages rattled past, their lamps casting fleeting shadows across the faces of the people who ran alongside the cart, keeping pace with the horse despite the uneven ground. Some laughed, others cursed. A boy no older than 10 threw a stone that clattered against the wheel rim, sparking briefly in the dark before disappearing into the mud. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the constable's boot, scuffed and caked with street filth, because looking at the crowd made her feel as though she were drowning in a sea of open mouths. "Do not speak to them," the second man said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the clatter of the hooves. "Anything you say will be used against you at the Old Bailey." "I have said nothing." Her throat was dry, the words scraping against her palate like sand. "I have maintained my innocence since the cellar." "Save it for the judge." As he shifted his weight, the fabric of his coat whispered against the wood. "They do not want truth, they want a spectacle." The cart slowed as they approached the turning for Newgate Street. The crowd grew denser here, pressing in until the horse had to be reined in to avoid trampling the front rank. The smell changed. The coal smoke thinned, replaced by the damp, sour odor of the prison, a scent that clung to the stone walls like a persistent mold. Newgate loomed ahead, a massive block of masonry that blocked out the sky, its windows barred and dark. Eliza felt the breath hitch in her chest, a physical obstruction that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with the fear tightening around her ribs. This was where the invisible became visible. Inside those walls, a servant girl was no longer part of the household furniture, but a distinct entity marked for destruction. The gates groaned open. Iron scraped against iron, a high-pitched shriek that set her teeth on edge. The cart rolled into the yard, the wheels crunching over gravel, and came to a halt beneath the archway. The second man jumped down first, landing with a heavy thud, and offered a hand to the constable. Neither offered one to her. Eliza slid off the bench, her legs stiff from the cold and the tension of the ride, and stumbled when her feet hit the ground. The rope between her wrists pulled taut, jerking her upright before she could fall. Inside. They marched her across the yard, past the wards where other prisoners leaned against the bars, their hands reaching out through the gaps like claws seeking purchase. Some begged for tobacco, others asked for news. Eliza kept her gaze forward, focusing on the door ahead, a heavy oak structure reinforced with iron studs that looked as though it had been built to withstand a siege. The key turned in the lock with a solid click. The door swung inward, revealing a corridor lit by flickering oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the damp stone walls. The air inside was still. It lacked the wind of the street, but carried the heavier burden of human respiration, the accumulated breath of hundreds of souls trapped within the same stone lungs. A warder waited near the entrance, holding a ledger and a quill that looked too fine for such a place. He glanced at Eliza, then at the constable, and dipped the quill into an inkwell without speaking. Name. Eliza Fenning. Her voice sounded small in the corridor, swallowed by the stone. Georgian. Poisoning with intent to kill, the constable spoke for her, his tone flat and bureaucratic. He declared the crime committed by the magistrate at Bow Street, adding that she was remanded to Newgate until trial. The warder wrote it down. The scratch of the nib on paper was the only sound in the hall, a dry, rhythmic noise that echoed the ticking of a clock she could not see. He tore the page from the book and handed it to the second man, who tucked it into his coat pocket with an efficiency that suggested this was a routine transaction, no different from logging a crate of goods at the docks. Cell 4, the warder said, gesturing down the passage with his chin. It is occupied, mind your footing. They pushed her forward again. The corridor narrowed, the walls closing in until Eliza felt she could touch both sides with her elbows extended. The floor was uneven, flagged with stone that had been worn smooth by centuries of shuffling feet. She passed a cell where a woman was singing a lullaby to a child who was not there, the tune broken and discordant, rising and falling in a way that made Eliza's stomach turn. She looked away, focusing on the back of the constable's coat, on the frayed edge of the cuff where the thread had come undone. At cell 4, the warder stopped. He unlocked the door and swung it open, revealing a small space dominated by a wooden bunk and a bucket in the corner. A figure lay on the bunk, wrapped in a rough wool blanket, facing the wall. The light from the corridor spilled in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. In, the constable said, giving the rope a final tug. Eliza stepped over the threshold. The straw on the floor crunched beneath her shoes. She turned to face them, expecting the rope to be cut, expecting some acknowledgement that she was now secure, but the constable simply looped the end of the line around an iron ring set into the wall near the door. We return at dawn, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Do not attempt to disturb the other prisoners. Wait, the word slipped out before she could check it. My hands, the rope, it is cutting into the wound. The constable looked at her wrists, at the blood that had seeped through the linen bandages and stained the hemp. He looked at her face, really looked at her, for the first time since the cellar. There was no pity in his eyes, only a weary resignation, the look of a man who has seen too many wounds to care about the source. Better the rope than the gallows, he said. He closed the door, the lock clicked. The sound was final, a period at the end of a sentence she had not finished writing. Eliza stood in the darkness, listening to their footsteps recede down the corridor, fading until they were replaced by the coughing of the woman on the bunk and the distant, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere deep within the walls. She lifted her bound hands to her chest, feeling the pulse fluttering beneath the tarred fiber, and realized with a sinking certainty that the silence of the cell was far heavier than the noise of the crowd had ever been. Darkness pressed against her eyes, thick and granular like the soot that coated the kitchen pots. She waited for the shapes to emerge from the gloom, for the bunk, the bucket, the huddled form beneath the wool. The rope chafed, a raw burn where the hemp rubbed against the swollen flesh of her wrist, right over the lane where the pulse jumped. Eliza shifted her weight, the straw crunching beneath her shoes, and tested the length of the tether. 3 feet, perhaps 4. Enough to reach the corner near the door, but not the bunk. She drew her bound hands towards her bodice, fingers fumbling at the pocket hidden within the folds of her skirt. The fabric was stiff with dried paste and flour, a crust that cracked under her nails. Inside, her fingers closed around a small, cylindrical object. Charcoal. She had taken it from the hearth without thinking, a reflex born of years spent marking loaves and lining ovens, and now it felt like a weapon or a lifeline, she could not decide which. Beside it lay a scrap of paper, torn from a bill for coal, rough and grey. "Keep still." The voice came from the bunk, rasping and low. The figure beneath the blanket did not turn, but the tension in the shoulders was visible even in the dim light. "I must write," Eliza said, her throat feeling lined with dust. "It is for my father." "They hear the scratch," the woman coughed, a wet, tearing sound that seemed to rattle the ribs of the cell itself. "The turnkeys, they listen for trouble, noise brings the whip." Eliza froze. The charcoal hovered above the paper, suspended in the air between her knees. She looked towards the door, at the solid oak that separated them from the corridor. Beyond that wood, men walked with keys and clubs, men who measured worth in decibels and obedience. She lowered her hand until the tip of the charcoal touched the paper. The friction was audible, a dry squeak that sounded like a mouse gnawing through a wainscot in a quiet house. She began to form the letters, "Dear Father." The D was too large, the loop swelling out where her hand shook. She pressed harder, trying to control the tremor, but the blood in her wrists throbbed in time with the dripping water, a rhythmic distraction that pulled her focus away from the inkless marks. The rope pulled tight against her skin when she leaned forward, biting deeper, and she had to stop to adjust the position of her arms, lifting them above her head to relieve the pressure before bringing them down again. "Stop it," the woman on the bunk shifted, the blanket sliding down to reveal a face that was little more than shadows and sharp bones. "You will bring them down here. Do you want the irons?" "I have to tell him I am innocent." The words rushed out faster than she intended, a desperate gasp of air. "He will think I have forgotten him, and he will think I am guilty." "Everyone is guilty here." The woman rolled over, facing the wall again, presenting only the curve of her spine. "The magistrate does not care for truth. He cares for order. Write your letter if you must, but do not expect it to leave this room." Eliza ignored her. She focused on the next line, "I am safe." A lie. The charcoal snapped. The tip broke off and rolled across the straw, disappearing into the shadows near the bucket. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a sob, and dropped to her knees to search for it. Her fingers scrabbled in the dirt, finding bits of straw, a hard crust of bread, something soft that she did not want to identify. When she found the black fragment, it was coated in grime. She wiped it on her apron, leaving a smudge that looked like a bruise on the white linen. She tried again, "Do not worry." The letters were jagged, climbing uphill across the page as her hand cramped. The pain in her wrists was no longer a dull ache but a sharp, stinging fire that shot up her forearms whenever she applied pressure. She could feel the heat of the inflammation, the skin tight and shiny under the bandages. The rope restricted her movement, forcing her to write at an awkward angle, her elbow jutting out like a wing, unstable and prone to shaking. Outside the cell, a door slammed. The sound echoed down the corridor, a heavy boom that vibrated through the stone floor and up through the soles of her shoes. Eliza flinched, the charcoal digging a deep groove into the paper, tearing through the fiber. The word worry was ruined, bisected by a black scar. She stared at the damage, feeling a hot prickling behind her eyes that she refused to let fall. Tears would wet the paper. Tears would make the marks run. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. "See," the woman's voice was muffled by the wall. They are coming. Eliza clutched the paper to her chest, shielding it with her bound hands. She scrambled backward until the rope pulled taut, jerking her shoulders, and she sat back on her heels, waiting. The footsteps approached. They were not the shuffling tread of the warders who had locked them in, nor the heavy boots of the constables. These steps were measured, deliberate, the click of hard leather on stone indicating a man who knew he had the right to walk wherever he chose. The light under the door changed. The gap at the bottom, previously dark, now held a thin line of yellow illumination from a lamp in the corridor. It stretched across the straw, cutting the cell in two, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the sudden draft. Eliza pressed the paper into her pocket, pushing it deep beneath the charcoal, hiding the evidence of her rebellion. She smoothed her apron over her knees, trying to look composed, trying to look like a servant who belonged in a kitchen rather than a cage. The key scraped in the lock. The sound was louder this time, metallic and grinding, as if the mechanism had not been oiled in a decade. The door swung inward, and the light from the corridor flooded the space, blinding her for a moment. She squinted, raising a hand to shield her eyes, and saw the silhouette of a man standing in the frame. He was tall, wearing a coat of dark cloth that looked expensive, the collar turned up against the damp chill of the prison. He did not step inside. He remained on the threshold, looking down at her as one might look at a dog that had fouled the rug. Eliza Fenning. The voice was familiar. It carried the cadence of Ormond Street, of the dining room where she had served potatoes and poured small beer. Mr. Turner. He held a candle in one hand, the flame flickering in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows that made his face look hollowed out and severe. Sir, she kept her head down, looking at his boots. They were polished, free of the mud that coated the constable's footwear. I did not expect visitors. Expectation is a dangerous habit in this place. Turner stepped over the threshold, the candlelight revealing the tight set of his jaw, the way his eyes avoided looking directly at her face, focusing instead on the rope binding her wrists. I have come to offer you a chance at redemption, a chance to spare your family the shame of a public spectacle. Eliza said nothing. She kept her hands in her lap, hiding the tremor that had returned now that the writing was done. The charcoal dust on her fingers stained the white of her apron, a small, dark mark that looked suspiciously like powder. Turner saw it. His gaze lingered on her hand for a second, then moved away, but the pause was long enough to make her stomach turn over. Speak, girl. He moved closer, the heat from the candle warming the air between them. Silence is an admission. You know the law. I have nothing to say. Her voice was a whisper barely audible over the dripping water, except that I am innocent. Turner sighed, a sound of weary disappointment that cut deeper than anger. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, crisp and white, stark against the gloom of the cell. He held it out to her, not offering it, but displaying it, letting her see the space at the bottom where a signature should go. Read it, he said, then sign. It is the only way to ensure your father is not dragged into this mire. Eliza looked at the paper. She looked at the man who had paid her wages, who had eaten the food she prepared, who now stood between her and the gallows with a confession in his hand. The rope around her wrists felt suddenly heavier, dragging her arms down towards the straw, pulling her towards the earth. Sir, the woman on the bunk spoke again, her voice sharp. The turnkey said no visitors after lockup. Turner did not turn. He kept his eyes on Eliza. This will not take long. Eliza reached for the paper. Her hand hovered over the white surface, the charcoal stain on her thumb stark against the clean linen of the sheet. She could feel the eyes of the cellmate on her back, could feel the weight of the rope, the heat of the candle, the expectation hanging in the air like smoke. She touched the edge of the paper. It did not move. Her finger stopped at the crease. The paper did not yield. It remained stiff, held firm by Turner's grip, which had tightened until the knuckles showed white against the dark wool of his sleeve. He was not offering a choice. He was presenting a verdict already written, waiting only for the ink to make it official. The candle flame guttered in the draught from the open door, casting a shadow that made Turner's nose look like a beak, sharp and predatory, poised to peck at the remains of her reputation. Take it, he said, the command dropping low, meant only for her ears, though the other woman on the bunk had gone perfectly still, her breathing the only sound in the wet stone room. Sign your name, Eliza. Admit the heat of the moment, the confusion of the kitchen. Say you meant no harm, only a mistake in the measuring. A mistake. The word tasted of ash in her mouth, dry and choking. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into the palm to hide the black stain of the charcoal, the evidence of her own futile attempt to speak before this man had arrived. There was no mistake, sir. I put no arsenic in the dumplings. Turner's face hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening as if carved by a chisel. He shifted his weight, the polished leather of his boot grinding a piece of straw into the dirt floor, a small, violent act that spoke of his impatience, his need to have this thing settled so he could return to the warmth of Ormond Street and forget the smell of this place. Then you leave me no option. If you will not save yourself, consider your father. Do you wish him to be questioned by the magistrates? To have his character dragged through the papers alongside yours? The threat landed heavy, a physical blow that made her shoulders hunch. She saw her father's face, lined with the worry of a man who had worked too hard and earned too little, standing before a judge who would listen to a master like Turner and hear only truth. The image burned behind her eyes, sharper than the gloom of the cell. She looked at the paper again, at the blank space where her signature would seal his fate as surely as the rope would seal hers. The air in the cell felt thick, clogged with the scent of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the cloying sweetness of the candle tallow, a mixture that made her stomach heave. He knows I am innocent, she said, but her voice lacked force, cracking on the last syllable. He knows I would not hurt a fly, let alone the family I served. Knowledge is not proof, Turner snapped, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the frustration simmering beneath. The court requires a narrative. They require a reason. Give them a reason that does not paint you as a monster. Sign the confession, say it was an error in the pantry, and I will speak to the sheriff. I will ensure your end is quick. The offer hung between them, terrible and seductive, a quick end, a mercy in the final moment. She could almost feel the drop, the sudden jerk, the darkness swallowing the pain. But to sign was to admit the lie, to take the poison into her soul before it ever touched her body. It was to become the thing they said she was. She shook her head, a small, jerky motion that made the ropes bite deeper into her wrists. I cannot sign what is not true. Turner stared at her, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes, turning them into flat, unfeeling discs. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The water continued to drip somewhere in the corridor, a rhythmic ticking that marked the passing of seconds she would never get back. The woman on the bunk shifted, the straw rustling loudly in the silence, a reminder that they were not alone, that there were witnesses to this private execution of hope. You are a fool, Turner said, the words quiet, devoid of anger now, filled only with a cold, dismissive pity. A stubborn, foolish girl, you choose the scaffold over the truth. I choose the truth, Eliza whispered, lifting her chin, meeting his gaze for the first time since he had entered. Her eyes burned, dry and gritty, but she did not look away. And I choose God as my judge, not you. Turner's lip curled, a flicker of disgust that twisted his features. He withdrew the paper, folding it sharply along the original crease, the sound crisp and final in the damp air. He tucked it back into his coat, smoothing the fabric over his chest as if brushing away dust. Then you have chosen your path. Do not expect me to visit you again. Do not expect anyone to remember you with kindness when the crowd gathers. He turned on his heel, the movement abrupt, ending the conversation as if it had never been more than a transaction that had failed to close. He stepped towards the door, the light from his candle swinging with his stride, casting wild, leaping shadows against the stone walls that seemed to reach for Eliza before retreating. The woman on the bunk let out a breath, a long, shuddering exhalation that sounded like a sob held back too long. Wait, Eliza said, the word tearing from her throat before she could stop it. Turner paused, 1 foot already over the threshold, but he did not turn back. His silhouette was framed by the yellow light of the corridor, a dark cutout against the brightness, impenetrable and distant. There is nothing more to say, Eliza. You have made your choice. My father, she said, her voice rising, desperate now, clawing at the air. Tell him I did not mean to cause him shame. Tell Hema. Tell him yourself, Turner interrupted, his voice flat and echoing slightly in the passage. If you can find the words when the time comes, but do not ask me to carry messages for a liar. He stepped out into the corridor. The turnkey, a bulky shape in the gloom, moved to close the door. Eliza surged forward, the ropes jerking her back, her hands reaching out towards the sliver of light that was rapidly disappearing. "Sir, please." The door slammed shut. The lock clicked, the metallic snap sounding like a bone breaking. Darkness rushed back into the cell, heavier than before, pressing against her eyes, filling her lungs. The candlelight was gone, leaving only the faint grey glow from the high window, which offered no comfort, no warmth, only a view of the sky that was hidden behind bars. She stood there, her arms still outstretched, her fingers grasping at empty air, the phantom heat of the candle still lingering on her skin. "Sit down, girl," the woman on the bunk muttered, her voice rough with disuse. "Screaming won't open the door. Nothing opens the door but the hangman." Eliza lowered her arms. The rope burned her wrists, a hot, stinging line of pain that grounded her in the reality of her situation. She turned away from the door, her legs feeling weak, as if the bones had turned to water. She walked back to the straw, her footsteps silent on the damp floor, and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. The charcoal nub was still in her pocket, a hard, useless lump against her thigh. She touched it through the fabric, feeling its rough texture, remembering the scratch of it on the paper, the futile attempt to leave a mark. Outside in the corridor, the sound of boots echoed again as they moved away, retreating down the passage with a rhythm steady and unhurried. Click, clack. Each step sounded like a hammer striking an anvil, counting down the moments until the sun rose, until the cart arrived, until the drop fell. Click, clack. Though the sound faded, the rhythm remained in her head, a relentless drumbeat that matched the pounding of her own heart and drove her towards a silence she could no longer escape. The gaslight hissed, a serpent of blue flame trapped in glass, spitting sparks that danced like tiny, mocking stars above the dock. Eliza stood. Her feet found the wooden floorboards, worn smooth by the tread of countless others who had stood there to be weighed and found wanting. The heat from the lamps pressed against her face, dry and suffocating, baking the moisture from her skin until her lips felt like cracked parchment ready to split. She blinked, trying to clear the glare, but the light did not merely shine. It invaded, piercing the pupils, forcing her to squint against the brilliance that turned the courtroom into a blinding white void where shadows were forbidden. Men in wigs sat before her, rows of them, their faces obscured by the powder that clung to their curls like frost on a winter window, making them look less like men and more like statues carved from stale dough. They watched, not with the curiosity of neighbors peering over a garden wall, but with the cold, detached scrutiny of surgeons preparing to cut into a diseased limb. Their eyes moved over her, stripping away the coarse wool of her dress, the rough linen of her shift, until she felt naked, flayed open for their inspection. She wanted to wrap her arms around herself, to hide the trembling of her hands, but the dock rail was too high, a barrier that pinned her in place, exposing her to the gaze of the entire room. A murmur rose from the gallery, a low, rumbling sound like distant thunder rolling across the city, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of her shoes. It was not words she heard, but the texture of their voices, the wet click of tongues, the sharp intake of breath, the rustle of silk and broadcloth as the fashionable leaned forward to get a better view of the spectacle. They had come to see a monster, a poisoner. A girl who would kill her masters for the price of a few shillings and a stolen spoon. She could feel their expectation pressing against her chest, a physical weight that made it hard to draw breath, hard to remember the rhythm of her own heart. "Silence," the crier barked, his voice cracking like a whip, cutting through the din. The noise died, not instantly, but in a slow, reluctant fade, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind the wet, sucking sound of disappointment. Eliza gripped the rail. Her knuckles turned white, the skin stretching tight over the bone, but she could not feel the wood beneath her fingers, only the numbness that had spread from her stomach out to her extremities. She tried to speak, to say something, anything that might break the spell, but her tongue felt too large for her mouth, a dead weight that refused to move. Mr. Gurney, the ordinary, sat to her right, his black robes absorbing the light, his face a mask of solemn pity that offered no comfort. He leaned in slightly, the smell of old paper and damp wool rising from his clothes, a scent that reminded her of the cellar, of the dark corners where the rats scuttled. "Stand straight, Eliza," he whispered, the words barely audible over the scratching of the clerk's quill. Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. She straightened her spine, the movement stiff, mechanical, as if her body were being pulled by strings attached to her shoulders. The effort cost her, a sharp pain shooting up her back, but she held the posture, chin lifted, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge's bench, somewhere where the air might be clearer. She would not cry, not here, not while they watched. Tears were for the privacy of the cell, for the dark hours when no one could see the weakness. Here in the light she had to be stone. The judge shifted in his chair, the silk of his robes rustling, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. He adjusted his wig, a nervous twitch that betrayed the humanity beneath the costume, before fixing his gaze upon her. His eyes were small, dark, and unreadable, reflecting nothing of the woman standing before him, only the cold calculation of the law. He looked at her as one might look at a broken tool, something that had failed in its function and must now be discarded. The prisoner, Eliza Fenning, the clerk announced, his voice monotone, devoid of inflection, reading from a sheet of paper that seemed to contain her entire existence. Charged with feloniously administering poison to Robert Turner, Sarah Turner, and Gideon Turner, with intent to kill. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic, settling over the room like a fog. Poison. The word itself seemed to carry a taste, metallic and bitter, coating the back of her throat. She swallowed, trying to wash it away, but the flavor remained, persistent and cloying. It was not the taste of arsenic, she knew that, but the taste of accusation, of a story written by others that she had no power to edit. A man in the front row, a surgeon by the look of his linen and the steel instruments glinting in his pocket, leaned towards his neighbor. "See how she stands," he murmured, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "No remorse, pure obstinacy." "The sullen sort are always the worst," the neighbor replied, nodding, his face a mirror of agreement. "Hidden malice, you see it in the set of the jaw." Eliza flinched. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, landing squarely in her chest, knocking the wind from her lungs. Sullen, obstinate. They were twisting her silence, her inability to speak against the roar of their certainty, into proof of her guilt. She opened her mouth, desperate to explain, to tell them that her throat was closed, that the fear had lodged itself there like a stone, but no sound came out. Only a dry click, a futile attempt at speech that was swallowed by the vastness of the room. The gaslight flickered, the flame dipping low for a second before surging back up, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floor, reaching for her like grasping hands. In that moment of altered light, the faces of the men in wigs seemed to shift, their features blurring, becoming indistinct, merging into a single, multi-eyed creature that devoured her with its stare. She was not a person here, she was a specimen, a thing to be pinned, examined, dissected. The dough of her life, once warm and rising with possibility, had been kneaded into something hard and unyielding, baked in the oven of their judgment until it was black and brittle. "Let the evidence be brought forward," the judge commanded, his voice booming, filling the space, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. A bailiff moved to the side table, lifting a silver platter that gleamed under the lamps. On it sat a lump of grayish matter, shriveled and dry, the remains of a dumpling. It looked innocuous, harmless, a piece of food that had been left too long on the sideboard. Yet, as the platter was carried towards the bench, a collective intake of breath swept through the gallery, a hiss of revulsion and fascination. That small, dead thing held the power of life and death. It was the anchor of her fate, the physical manifestation of the crime she had not committed. Eliza watched it pass, her eyes tracing the rough texture of the dough, the way it crumbled slightly at the edges. She remembered the making of it, the feel of the flour between her fingers, the warmth of the water, the rhythmic kneading that had once been a comfort, a meditation. Now that memory felt distant, tainted, as if the very act of baking had been a prelude to murder. The smell of yeast, usually so comforting, seemed to curdle in her nose, turning sour, mixing with the scent of the courtroom, the coal smoke, the unwashed bodies of the crowd. The surgeon took the platter, holding it up for the court to see, turning it slowly so that every angle was visible. "This," he said, his voice clinical, precise, "was recovered from the vomit of Mr. Turner. Analysis confirms the presence of arsenic in quantities sufficient to cause death." A ripple of agreement went through the room. Heads nodded. Quills scratched faster. The narrative was solidifying, hardening around her like cement, sealing her inside a tomb of facts that she could not escape. She wanted to scream, to tell them that the flour had been damp, that the sack had smelled odd, that she had warned Mrs. Turner, but the words stuck in her throat, trapped behind the wall of her own terror. The judge looked from the dumpling to her, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark pools that reflected nothing. "Do you have anything to say to this, prisoner?" Eliza opened her mouth. The air rushed in, cold and sharp, scraping her lungs. She tried to form the words, to push them past the blockage, but her tongue remained heavy, useless. The silence stretched, growing thicker, heavier, until it filled the room, drowning out the sound of the gaslight, the scratching of the quills, the breathing of the crowd. It was a silence that spoke louder than any plea, a silence that they would interpret as guilt, as arrogance, as the final confession of a soul beyond redemption. She closed her mouth. Her hands tightened on the rail until the wood groaned under the pressure. The gaslight hissed again, a final serpentine warning as the judge reached for the black cap, the fabric dark and absorbing, ready to blot out the light forever. Content details to preserve. Grey lump on silver. Shriveled corpse of pastry. No resemblance to soft, steaming bundles. Eliza pulled them from the pot 2 nights prior. It looked dead, dried out, a stone rather than sustenance. Mr. Barker, the surgeon, held the plateau. Delicate pinch, like handling a diseased rat. Wrist angled. Gaslight caught the crusted surface. Made the poison gleam like sugar. Current rhythm issue, sentences 2, 3, and 4 are 3 short fragment statements in a row. It looked dead, dried out, a stone rather than sustenance. This violates the new constraint, never more than 2 short sentences in a row. Observe the consistency, Barker said, turning the plate a fraction, the silver scraping against his thumbnail with a high, thin shriek that set Eliza's own teeth on edge. Hardened, discolored, precisely as one would expect when arsenic interrupts the fermentation of the yeast. A murmur rolled through the gallery, a low, wet sound like wind blowing through a crowd of cattle, shifting from foot to foot in the straw-strewn aisles. They leaned forward, necks craned, eyes hungry for the sight of the weapon that had nearly toppled a master of the city. To them, it was a curiosity, a parlor trick of chemistry performed on a dinner plate. To Eliza, it was a lie made solid. She knew that dough. She knew the way it should yield under a thumb, the specific elasticity of flour mixed with suet and water, the way it breathed while it cooked. This thing on the platter was a stranger. "That is not how it looked," she whispered, the words scraping out of her throat, raw and brittle. "It was soft, warm." "Speak up, prisoner," the judge snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "The court cannot hear your mutterings." "It was not hard," Eliza said, louder this time, forcing air past the stone in her gullet. "The dumpling I served was light. It rose properly. I checked the yeast myself. It was fresh from the baker on Holborn." Barker turned his head slowly, fixing her with a look of mild, academic pity, as one might regard a child insisting the moon is made of cheese. "The chemical reaction alters the texture, Miss Fenning. The poison binds with the gluten, creating a density that prevents proper rising. What you see is the truth of the matter, not the memory of a frightened girl." "But I felt it," she insisted, her fingers digging into the wooden rail of the dock until the splinters bit into her palms. "I held it. It was soft." "Your touch is unreliable," Barker countered, his tone smooth, oiled, impenetrable. "Science does not rely on the fallible sensations of a servant's hand. We rely on the precipitate. We rely on the test." He dipped a glass rod into a small vial of liquid he had produced from his coat, touching it to the edge of the dumpling. The spot darkened instantly, a bruise spreading across the dough. "There, the garlic odor. Can you not smell it?" Eliza strained her nose, desperate to catch the scent, to find the proof of her own innocence or guilt in the air. She smelled only the stale breath of the crowd, the damp wool of their coats, the acrid tang of the coal smoke drifting down from the lamps. There was no garlic, only the dusty, dead smell of old flour. Yet the court reacted as if a foul stench had filled the room. Men pulled handkerchiefs to their faces. Women recoiled, fanning themselves with gloved hands. The theater of it was absolute. They smelled what they were told to smell, saw what they were instructed to see. "The recipe," Eliza tried again, the words tumbling out now in a desperate rush, a dam breaking under pressure. I used the same as always. 2 pounds of flour, a gill of milk, the suet chopped fine. Mrs. Turner knows, she watches me, she sees the sack. Mrs. Turner, the prosecutor interjected, stepping forward from the shadows where he had been lurking, his silhouette sharp against the yellow light, has testified that you were alone in the kitchen during the preparation, that she entered only after the illness had begun. No, Eliza said, shaking her head in a motion that was jerky and uncontrolled. She came in, touched the sack, and said it felt damp. And yet, the prosecutor said, turning to the jury, spreading his hands in a gesture of helpless logic, the mistress is a woman of unimpeachable character, while the servant stands here, accused by the very food she prepared, her story shifting with every question. First it was the yeast, now it is the sack. Next, perhaps, it will be the wind from the window. Laughter rippled through the room, not a roar, but a nasty, stifled chuckle, the sound of men enjoying a clever turn of phrase at the expense of someone who could not fight back. It was a physical weight, that laughter, pressing down on her shoulders, pushing her towards the floor. She wanted to scream the truth, to tell them about the way the flour had clumped, the strange, sweet taste on her tongue when she had tested the batter, the way Mr. Turner had looked at her before he fell, his eyes wide not with anger but with confusion. But the words tangled in her mouth, knotted by the sheer impossibility of making them understand. They did not want the truth. They wanted a narrative. They wanted a monster, and she was the only candidate available. The consistency is irrelevant, Barker stated, placing the platter back on the table with a finality that echoed like a gavel strike. The presence of the mineral is absolute. The dumpling is the vessel. The prisoner is the hand that filled it. Eliza looked at the dumpling one last time. It sat there, innocent and damning, a small white monument to her destruction. She thought of her hands, red and chapped from the lye and the hot water, the hands that had kneaded that dough with care, with the intention of feeding the family that paid her wages. Those hands were now the hands of a murderer. The transformation was complete. The science had spoken. The silver platter had testified. "Do you have any further questions for the witness?" the judge asked, his quill hovering over the paper, ready to seal the moment in ink. Eliza opened her mouth. Nothing came. The stone was back, larger now, blocking everything. She shook her head, a tiny, defeated movement. "Then the evidence is admitted," the judge said, dipping the pen. The scratch of the nib on the paper was loud, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to tear through the silence of the room, recording her fate in permanent, black strokes. The surgeon stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth, the transaction complete. He had delivered the death warrant on a plate, and the court had swallowed it whole. Eliza felt the gaze of the room shift, no longer curious, but condemnatory. The speculation was over. The verdict was already written in the set of their jaws, in the way they avoided looking directly at her, as if her guilt were a contagion that might spread through eye contact. She stood alone in the dock, the wood cold against her hips, the gaslight buzzing overhead like a trapped fly, waiting for the final blow that she knew, with a terrible, sinking certainty, was already on its way. The dumpling remained on the table, a silent, grey accuser that no amount of pleading could silence. The question hung in the air, a trap baited with courtesy. Did she have anything further? The words floated, harmless as dust motes in the gaslight, yet they carried the weight of a closing coffin lid. Eliza opened her mouth, intending to speak of the damp sack, of Mrs. Turner's own fingers brushing the flour, of the way the kitchen fire had spat that morning, unsettling the yeast. She meant to say that a servant does not poison the hand that feeds her, for if the master dies, the servant starves. It was a logic so plain, so rooted in the survival of the poor, that it should have been undeniable. But the air in the courtroom had turned thick, a gelatinous substance that filled her lungs and refused to be exhaled. Her tongue, usually quick enough to barter with fishmongers or soothe a crying child, felt swollen, alien, a lump of dead meat in her throat. The stone she had felt earlier was no longer just in her stomach. It had risen, lodging itself behind her teeth, sealing her lips with a force greater than any shackle. She looked at the prosecutor. He waited, his face a mask of polite expectation, his quill poised to catch whatever confession or plea might tumble out. Behind him, the jury sat in their box, 12 men of property and standing, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamps, eyes bright with the anticipation of a conclusion. They did not see a frightened girl struggling for breath. They saw sullenness. They saw the arrogant silence of a criminal who knew her game was up and refused to grant them the satisfaction of a beggar's remorse. The laughter from moments before had died, replaced by a heavy, watchful stillness that pressed against her eardrums, louder than any shout. It was the silence of a room holding its breath before the strike, a collective inhalation that sucked the oxygen from her vicinity. The sound was a dry crack, a twig snapping under a heavy boot. No more followed. Her throat worked, the muscles straining against the invisible vice, but no air passed to carry the words. She tried to lift her hand to point at the turners seated in the gallery, to indicate the mistress whose gaze was fixed rigidly on a prayer book in her lap, refusing to meet Eliza's desperate, pleading stare. Her arm felt leaden, anchored to the wooden rail of the dock by some unseen chain. The paralysis was not merely emotional, it was a physical seizing, a rebellion of the body against the mind's frantic commands. She was a puppet with cut strings, collapsing in full view of an audience that interpreted her collapse as defiance. Silence is often the loudest admission, the prosecutor observed, his voice smooth, carrying easily to the back of the gallery where the common folk craned their necks, hungry for the spectacle of a servant brought low. He turned to the jury, spreading his arms wide, encompassing Eliza, the dock, the entire tragic theatre of the Old Bailey. Look upon her, gentlemen, see how she stands mute when confronted with the plain facts of science and the testimony of her betters. She offers no rebuttal to the chemical proof. She offers no explanation for the suffering of the family she served. She offers only this stony, impenetrable refusal to speak. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a low, guttural sound of agreement. It was the noise of a beast being fed, a confirmation of their suspicions. They had come expecting a monster, and her inability to articulate her innocence served only to sharpen the horns they had already painted upon her forehead. Eliza wanted to scream, to tear at her own throat until the words spilled out in a bloody rush, but the freeze held her fast, a cold rigor mortis spreading through her living limbs. She saw the clerk's hand moving, the quill dancing across the parchment, scratching out a record of her silence, translating her terror into evidence of guilt. The prisoner offered no defense. That is what he was writing. She could see the ink forming the letters, black and permanent, sealing her fate faster than any judge could speak. "It is the way of her kind," a voice whispered nearby, loud enough to cut through the murmurs, belonging to a woman in a bonnet who leaned towards her companion. Sullen to the last, no gratitude for the master who took her in, no repentance before God. Eliza flinched as if struck. The words landed with physical force, bruising her spirit. She was not sullen, she was drowning, but the distinction was lost, washed away by the tide of their certainty. The architecture of the gaze had completed its work. They looked at her and saw only what they wished to see, a reflection of their own fears about the invisible hands that cooked their food and tended their fires. Her humanity had been erased, overwritten by the narrative of the poisonous servant, a trope as old and familiar as the bread they ate. She was no longer Eliza Fenning, daughter of a wharfinger, girl who loved to dance and dreamt of a husband. She was the vessel of the arsenic, the thing that had touched the dumpling, the anomaly that needed to be excised to restore order to the world of Ormond Street. The judge shifted in his high seat, the silk of his robes rustling, a dry, insectile sound that signaled the end of the interlude. He adjusted his wig, pulling it straight upon his head, his expression one of weary duty. There was no anger in his face, no malice. That was the most terrifying part of all. He was merely a mechanism, a cog in a great machine that ground the poor into dust with bureaucratic efficiency. He looked down at her, his eyes sliding over her as one might look at a broken tool, useless and beyond repair. "If the prisoner has no further questions and the defense offers no additional testimony," the judge intoned, his voice resonating with the formal cadence of the law, stripping the moment of any personal warmth, "then the court must proceed to judgment." He reached for the small black cap that lay folded on the desk beside him. It was a simple thing, a piece of plain black fabric, unadorned and cheap, yet it carried more power than the crown itself. As he lifted it, the gaslight seemed to dim, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching out to meet the fabric. He unfolded it slowly, the movement deliberate, ritualistic, giving the room time to absorb the significance of the act. The air grew colder. The murmuring ceased entirely, replaced by a vacuum of sound, a void where hope used to be. Eliza watched the cap, mesmerized, unable to look away as the judge placed it upon his head. It sat there, a dark crown of death, absorbing the light, turning the judge's face into a mask of grim finality. "Elizabeth Fenning," he said, and his voice was no longer human, but the voice of the state, cold and absolute. "You have been found guilty of the felony of poisoning your master and his household with intent to kill. The evidence against you is clear, the science undeniable, and your own silence speaks volumes against your character." Eliza's knees buckled. She gripped the rail, her knuckles white, holding herself upright by sheer force of will, refusing to grant them the sight of her falling. The wood bit into her palms, a sharp, grounding pain in the swirling numbness of her mind. She looked at Mrs. Turner again, but the woman was still looking down, her lips moving in silent prayer, perhaps asking forgiveness for her role in this, or perhaps thanking God that the stain had been removed from her house. Mr. Turner sat beside her, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the judge, nodding slightly once, twice, in agreement with the inevitable. "The sentence of this court," the judge continued, the words falling like stones, one after another, building a wall between her and the living world, "is that you be taken from hence to the place from whence you came, and thence to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead." The word dead hung in the air, final and absolute. It did not echo, it landed and stayed, a heavy weight settling on the floorboards. "And may God have mercy on your soul." The clerk scratched the final line, the pen stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of a finished transaction. The deal was done. The life was priced and paid. Eliza stood in the dock, the black cap of the judge burning in her vision, the dumpling on the table now looking less like food and more like a tombstone. She had wanted to speak. She had wanted to tell them about the yeast, about the damp, about the terrible, sweet taste. But the words were gone, swallowed by the stone in her throat, leaving her alone in the roaring silence of her condemnation. The turnkeys moved towards her, their hands reaching out to claim what now belonged to the law, and she did not resist, for the fight had leaked out of her, leaving only a hollow shell waiting to be filled with the rope. The iron hinges screamed, a high, thin shriek of rusted metal tearing against rusted metal that scraped the inside of Eliza's skull before the door even swung wide. Damp rushed in ahead of the man, a cold breath carrying the scent of wet wool, tallow smoke, and the cloying, sweet rot of mildew that had eaten into the very mortar of Newgate. William Gurney filled the aperture, his black coat brushing the stone jambs, his presence expanding to fill the small cell until the air grew thick and hard to draw into her lungs. He carried a book bound in leather, so worn the grain had vanished, smoothed down by the thumbs of 100 condemned souls who had sought a pardon he could not give. "Miss Fenning," he said, and his voice was soft, oiled with a pity that felt heavier than the chains on her ankles. "We must speak of the state of your soul." He stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made her flinch, though she did not rise from the wooden stool bolted to the floor. The candle he placed on the rough table guttered, throwing his shadow up the wall where it danced like a hanged man kicking at the empty air. Gurney sat opposite her, the leather of his breeches creaking, and opened the Bible. The smell hit her then, distinct and nauseating, not just old paper, but the fungus of damp cells, the scent of things left too long in the dark without sun to kill them. It was the smell of the dumpling dough left out overnight, sour and rising with a life of its own. "The hour grows late," Gurney murmured, tracing a line of text with a finger stained by ink and candle grease. "The sheriff waits for my report. He needs to know if you depart this world in peace with your Maker, or if you carry the burden of unconfessed sin into the next." Eliza folded her hands in her lap. Her nails were broken, the cuticles ragged from picking at the seams of her dress, a nervous habit she could not break despite the pain. She looked at the book, then at his face, which was round and flushed, the skin tight over his cheeks, as if stretched by too much earnest concern. "I have told you, Mr. Gurney," she said, her voice sounding thin, stripped of the strength it had held in the kitchen at Ormond Street. "I have nothing to confess. I am innocent of the charge." Gurney sighed, a long, wet exhalation that fogged briefly in the chill air before dissipating. He did not look angry, he looked tired, the way a man looks when he has explained a simple sum to a child who refuses to understand the numbers. He leaned forward, the candlelight catching the moisture in his eyes, making them gleam with a terrifying benevolence. "Innocence in the eyes of the law is one matter, Eliza," he said, using her Christian name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl, a violation more intimate than a touch. "But innocence before God requires a cleansing of the spirit. You stand upon the precipice. To cling to a factual denial when your soul screams for mercy is a pride that will damn you faster than any arsenic." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, warm and heavy, intending to comfort but landing like a weight. She pulled back, just an inch, enough to break the contact, and his hand fell to the table with a dull thud. The rejection hung between them, sharp and jagged. "I did not poison them," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "I served them yeast and flour. I served them what I was given. If that was poison, then the poison was in the house before I ever touched the bowl." "But did you touch the bowl with malice?" Gurney pressed, his voice rising slightly, losing its oily smoothness for an edge of frustration. "Did you look at Mr. Turner, at the poor children, and feel a spark of hatred that guided your hand? God sees the heart, Eliza. He sees the shadows you keep hidden even from yourself. To say, 'I did not do it,' is not enough if you do not also say, 'I forgive those who accuse me, and I accept my punishment as just.'" Eliza stared at the candle flame. It wavered in the draught from the door, bending low then snapping back, a tiny struggle against the encroaching dark. She thought of the kitchen, the heat of the oven, the way the dough felt under her fingers, sticky and alive. She thought of Mrs. Turner's face when the vomiting started, the wide, horrified eyes that had instantly found her, the servant, the convenient vessel for blame. There was no malice in her heart, only a cold, hard knot of confusion that had settled there and refused to melt. "I cannot say I am guilty when I am not," she said, and her voice was steadier now, anchored by a stubbornness that felt like the only thing she owned. "To lie to you, sir, to lie to God at the very end, that would be the true sin, that would be the stain that would not wash." Gurney shook his head, a slow, rhythmic motion of disappointment. He closed the Bible with a snap that echoed like a pistol shot in the small space. The sound made her jump, her shoulders hunching towards her ears. He stood up, adjusting his clerical bands, smoothing the front of his coat as if brushing off the dust of her failure. "Obstinacy," he said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into a well. "You mistake stubbornness for virtue. The mob outside bays for your blood, Eliza. They want a monster. If you give them a martyr who refuses to repent, you feed their fury. If you give them a penitent sinner, you offer them a lesson. Is your pride worth the eternal fire? Is it worth the scandal you will leave behind?" He walked to the door, his hand on the iron latch, and looked back at her. The shadow of his wig seemed to swallow his face, leaving only the glint of his eyes visible in the gloom. "I shall return before dawn," he said, his tone flat, devoid of the earlier warmth. "Pray that the Holy Spirit loosens your tongue before then, for if you ascend the scaffold with a lie on your lips, claiming innocence where there is guilt, you die not as a servant of God, but as a child of the devil." The latch lifted, the door groaned open, revealing the dim corridor beyond where the torch of a passing turnkey cast long, flickering stripes across the stones. Gurney stepped out, leaving the Bible on the table between them, a heavy, mildewed block of judgment. He did not wait for a reply. He simply pulled the door shut, and the lock slid home with a metallic clack that severed the connection between her and the world of men who could speak, who could argue, who could be heard. Eliza sat alone in the sudden stillness, the candle sputtering as the draught died. The smell of the book lingered, thick and fungal, filling her nose until she could taste the rot on the back of her tongue. She looked at her hands, pale and trembling in the low light, and wondered if the stain he spoke of was already there, invisible to the eye but clear to the heavens, marking her as surely as the rope would mark her neck. Outside, a distant shout rose from the street, muffled by the thick walls, a fragment of the crowd's hunger that seeped through the stone to find her in the dark. She reached for the Bible, her fingers brushing the damp leather, then pulled back as if burned, leaving the book closed, its secrets and its demands untouched on the table. The candle guttered, a desperate sputter that threw the shadow of the Bible across the straw mattress, stretching the black leather into a shapeless beast that seemed to breathe against the wall. Eliza watched it expand and contract, her own chest mimicking the ragged rhythm, tight and insufficient. She needed air, not the thick, recycled stench of the cell, but the sharp, cold bite of the yard, even if it carried the smoke of 1,000 chimneys. Instead, she had the ordinary's words looping in her skull, a prayer wheel of condemnation that spun faster than she could stop it. Child of the devil. The phrase stuck in her throat, dry as unsifted flour. She stood, her knees cracked, a sharp, brittle sound in the quiet room. Walking to the small, high window was a chore of lifting leaden legs, each step an argument with gravity. The glass was thick, distorted, turning the sliver of night sky outside into a smear of grey wool. She pressed her forehead against the pane. Cold bit into her skin, a welcome pain, real and immediate. Below, somewhere beyond the stone and the iron bars, London slept or stumbled, indifferent to the geometry of her ending. Current structure. 1. I did not hate them, she said to the glass. Medium. 2. Her breath fogged a circle on the surface. The memory arrived unbidden, sharp and specific. Young Robert Turner, his fingers sticky with jam, laughing as she pulled a tray from the oven, the heat rolling off him in waves. There was no poison in that laugh, no malice in the way he had begged for an extra dumpling, his eyes wide and trusting. How could the thing that nourished him become the thing that killed him? The logic of it fractured, splintering under the weight of the accusation. If the flour was tainted, then the miller was the murderer. If the water was foul, then the parish was to blame. But the law required a hand to hold the knife, a heart to will the death, and she was the only servant in the house. The convenient vessel, Gurney's words again, they want a monster. A noise from the corridor broke her reverie. Footsteps, heavy, dragging, followed by the jingle of keys. Eliza stepped back from the window, retreating into the shadows, as if invisibility were a shield she could don. The door did not open for her. The sounds passed by, moving towards the cells further down the tier. Then, a voice. High, pleading, soaked in a terror that stripped it of dignity. Please, sir, I'll say it. I'll say whatever you like. Just let me write it down. It was Mary, the girl from the cell next to the washhouse, caught for stealing a length of ribbon. Eliza knew her only by the sound of her weeping at night, a constant, low hum that underscored the silence of Newgate. Now Mary's voice rose, cracking under the pressure of a hope she had manufactured for herself. Good, came the turnkey's grunt, devoid of sympathy. Get it out. The ordinary wants it before matins. I didn't mean to keep it, Mary babbled, the words tumbling over each other in a rush to satisfy the unseen listener, for she had just wanted to feel pretty. I'm sorry. She was so very sorry. I am guilty. Yes, she was guilty. The relief in her voice was palpable, a physical thing that seemed to seep under the door and fill the corridor. It was a transaction completed, a soul purchased with a lie. The footsteps moved away, lighter now, the burden of resistance lifted. Mary would sleep tonight. She would have the comfort of the chaplain's nod, the promise of a softer passage into whatever came next. She had given them the story they needed, a sinner repentant, a moral lesson wrapped in tears. Eliza turned back to the table. The Bible sat there, a dark block of authority. She looked at her hands again. They were rough, the nails broken, the skin chapped from the lye water and the cold. These were the hands that had kneaded the dough. These were the hands that Gurney claimed were stained with blood invisible to man. If she opened the book, if she fell to her knees and screamed her guilt to the rafters, would the stain vanish? Would the Turners rise from their sickbeds? Would the crowd go home satisfied? No, the lie would remain a lie, a new sin added to the ledger. She reached out, her finger tracing the edge of the cover. The leather was damp, sweating in the humid cell. She imagined opening it, speaking the words Gurney wanted. I accept my punishment as just. The tension in her shoulders would dissolve. The fear of the eternal fire would be extinguished by the performative act of contrition. It would be so easy, so terribly easy to let them have their monster, to play the part written for her by the master and the magistrate. Her tongue moved against her teeth. She bit down, hard. The taste of copper flooded her mouth, sharp and metallic, mingling with the fungal smell of the book. Pain bloomed, bright and clarifying. She did not swallow the blood. She let it pool, a small, secret testament to the truth that no one else wanted. To speak the lie would be to die twice, once on the scaffold and once in the soul, and she would not give them that second death. The candle flame dipped low, the wick drowning in a pool of its own wax, casting the room into a deepening twilight. Shadows lengthened, swallowing the corners, creeping towards the table. Eliza pulled her hand back from the Bible as if the book itself were hot. She would not touch it. She would not open it. Let Gurney write what he wished in his journal. Let him call her obstinate. Let him mark her as a child of the devil. Outside, the distant shout rose again, closer this time, a fragment of a song sung by drunkards or mourners, the melody broken and ragged. It seeped through the stone, a reminder of the world that continued, indifferent and loud. Inside, the silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against her eardrums. She sat down on the edge of the bunk, her hands folded in her lap, palms up, empty. She waited for the dawn, for the return of the man who would demand her soul, and she knew, with a cold certainty that settled in her gut like a stone, that she would give him nothing but the truth, even if it damned her to hell. The lock clicked in the distance, a prelude to the morning. The chaplain remained seated, his posture rigid, the spine of the Bible digging into his palm as if he sought to press the word of God into the wood of the table. He did not speak, he waited. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until the air in the cell felt thick enough to choke on. Outside, the jail breathed. Distant iron clangs resonated through the stone, a dull percussion marking the shift of warders, the movement of souls too broken to resist the machinery of the law. Eliza kept her hands folded in her lap, the knuckles white, the skin drawn tight over the bone. She could feel Gurney's gaze, heavy and expectant, resting upon her bowed head like a physical weight. He wanted the words. He needed the confession to balance the ledger of his own conscience, to justify the rope that waited in the yard. A shuffle of feet broke the stalemate, not the heavy tread of a turnkey, but the lighter, frantic scuff of a prisoner being led away. The sound halted directly beyond the thick oak of her door. "Is it done?" a voice, rough with disuse, queried from the corridor. "Yes, sir, she's signed it, said she's ready for the Lord." The reply came from Mary. Eliza knew the voice by the tremor in it, the high, thin note of a girl who had never learned to hide her fear. There was a rustle of paper, the scratch of a quill sealing a fate, and then a sound that struck Eliza harder than a blow, a sigh of relief, pure, unadulterated relief. Mary had lied. She had traded truth for peace, purchasing a moment of comfort with a falsehood that would follow her into eternity. The footsteps moved on, fading into the gloom of the passage, leaving behind a vacuum of quiet that felt accusatory. Gurney shifted in his chair. The leather of his boots creaked. He looked at Eliza, his expression softening into a pity that felt colder than anger. He believed the lie was easier. He believed she was stubborn because she was proud, not because she was honest. To him, truth was a variable to be managed, a thing to be bent until it fit the shape of the gallows. "You hear," Gurney said, his voice low, devoid of triumph. "She finds rest. You might too, Eliza. The burden is heavy for such slight shoulders." He gestured to the Bible. The black cover seemed to absorb the dim light of the candle, a void in the center of the table. To touch it would be to yield. To open it would be to admit that her life was a sin requiring correction. The temptation surged, hot and sudden. If she spoke the words he wanted, the tension in the room would snap. The chaplain would smile. The warders would treat her with a fraction more kindness. She could sleep without the weight of his disappointment hovering over her bunk. It would be so simple to let them have their narrative, to become the monster they required so the world could sleep soundly. Her jaw tightened, the muscles along her cheekbone knotted. She needed pain to anchor her, something real to cut through the fog of coercion. She pressed her teeth together, harder than nature intended, until the flesh of her tongue gave way. A burst of salt flooded her mouth, sharp and visceral, mingling with the damp air. She did not flinch. She let the hurt bloom, a bright, private signal that she was still her own. Blood welled, warm and thick, but she did not swallow. She held it there, a secret sacrament of defiance. Gurney watched her. He saw the tension in her neck, the slight tremor in her hands, but he did not see the blood. He saw only obstinacy. He closed the Bible with a snap that echoed like a gunshot in the small space. The sound finalized something. The hope of reconciliation, however thin, evaporated. "Very well," he said, rising. The chair scraped against the flagstones, a harsh grating noise that set Eliza's teeth on edge. "I shall note your state. God mercy you, for the court will not." He moved to the door. The candle flame shuddered in the draught created by his movement, casting long, dancing shadows that distorted the corners of the cell into looming shapes. He did not look back. There was no point. She had chosen her path and he had chosen his. The key turned in the lock, the metal grinding against metal, a sound that signified more than just imprisonment. It signified abandonment. He was leaving her to the dark, to the silence, to the truth that no one else wanted. When his footsteps faded, the cell returned to its natural state, damp, cold, and still. Eliza unclenched her jaw, though the salt taste lingered as a reminder of the line she had drawn. She looked at the Bible, which sat untouched like a block of authority that held no power over her soul. She would not read it, nor would she pray the prayers they scripted for the condemned. From the corridor, a new sound emerged, not the shuffle of prisoners, but the scratch of a quill on paper. Gurney was outside in the light of the warder's lantern, recording her refusal. He was writing her into history as a sinner who refused grace, ensuring that when the drop fell, the record would show she had died unrepentant. The ink would dry, the book would close. Her name would be mud in the parish registers, a warning to other servants who might forget their place. Eliza stood. Her legs felt stiff, the blood slow in her veins. She walked to the small window, the glass thick and distorted, offering no view of the sky, only a smear of grey light. Morning was coming. The shadows were retreating, but not from fear. They were simply making way for the sun that would warm the faces of the crowd gathering at Horsemonger Lane. They would want a spectacle. They would want to see the life leave her eyes. She placed her hand against the stone wall. It was cold, leaching the warmth from her palm. This was the only truth left. The stone did not lie. The rope did not lie. Everything else was performance. She turned from the window and sat on the edge of the bunk, her back straight. Let Gurney write. Let the court record her silence as guilt. She had her own ledger, and in it, her hands were clean. The scratch of the quill outside stopped. A door slammed. The jail settled into a new rhythm, the prelude to the final day. Eliza closed her eyes. She did not pray for mercy. She prayed for strength. The night was long, but the dawn was inevitable, and with it, the end of the waiting. The streets screamed before the sun had fully breached the rooftops of Holborn, a cacophony of hawker cries that tore through the damp morning mist like saws through green timber. The full confession, read the true account of the poisoner, bellowed a boy with ink-stained fingers, thrusting a damp sheet towards a passing drayman. The innocent martyr, see how the law hangs a lamb, shouted another, his voice cracking on the high note as he scattered papers into the gutter. They fluttered down, white and fragile against the black sludge of the road, settling in the mud like dirty snow that would not melt. Robert Turner stood at the window of his Ormond Street dining room, the glass cold against his forehead, watching the chaos unfold below with a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the chill. He had expected silence. He had expected the orderly conclusion of justice, the neat tying of a knot that would restore the sanctity of his household and bury the incident in the past where it belonged. Instead, the city had taken the matter into its own grime-covered hands, chewing over the bones of his private tragedy until they were picked clean and scattered for the dogs. A crumpled pamphlet stuck to the pane, held by a smear of wet clay, the bold typeface swimming in the condensation. Vindication of Eliza Fenning. The words seemed to pulse, accusing him from outside his own home. He yanked the sash down, the weight of it slamming into the sill with a thud that made the crystal decanters on the sideboard tremble, but the noise from the street seeped through the wood anyway, a low, buzzing hum of dissent. It was not the roar of a mob demanding blood, which he understood, which fit the architecture of the world as he knew it. It was a murmur of doubt, a questioning of the very foundation upon which his authority rested. If a servant could be innocent, then a master could be mistaken. If the girl was a martyr, then he was the villain. The logic was simple, arithmetic even, yet it struck him with the force of a physical blow, doubling him slightly over the table as he reached for the copy. One of his clerks had slipped onto his desk an hour prior. The paper felt cheap, rough-textured and smelling of wet ink and turpentine, nothing like the fine stationery he used for his ledgers. He smoothed it out, his fingers leaving greasy marks on the surface, and began to read the allegations printed in jagged, hurried type. They spoke of the dumplings with a familiarity that made his skin crawl, describing the yeast and the flour with a technical precision no layman should possess, twisting the domestic act of baking into a theater of conspiracy. Someone had spoken, someone from the kitchen, perhaps, or a neighbor who had watched too closely, feeding these pamphleteers with scraps of gossip that had fermented into lies. He traced the line where his own name appeared, not as the victim, but as the accuser, the word perjury lurking in the margins of the arguments like a shadow waiting to lengthen. His hand shook, just once, a betrayal of the nerves he kept so tightly corseted beneath his waistcoat. "So," voice came from the doorway, soft and tentative. It was the new housemaid, a girl barely into her teens whom they had hired only a fortnight ago to scrub the floors Eliza had once swept. She held a silver tray with a pot of coffee, her eyes fixed firmly on the pattern of the rug, refusing to meet his gaze. In the past, such an entrance would have been invisible, the servant a ghost moving through the rooms to replenish what was consumed. Now her presence filled the space, heavy and accusatory. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a helpful pair of hands, but a potential witness, a future author of another pamphlet, a vessel for secrets that could dismantle him. "Leave it," he said, his voice sharper than he intended, cracking slightly on the vowel. She flinched, a small, bird-like motion of the shoulders, and set the tray down with a clatter that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. The spoon jumped against the saucer, a bright, ringing note that hung in the air long after she had retreated, closing the door with a click that sounded like a lock engaging. He was alone again, yet the feeling of being watched persisted, a prickling on the back of his neck that no amount of turning could shake. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the voices outside rose in a new chorus, a hawker shouting about the Tiban tree and the blood of the poor. Turner picked up the coffee pot, the silver warm against his palm, and poured a cup. The liquid was dark, almost black, steaming in the cool air. He took a sip, but it tasted of ash, bitter and grounding. He could not drink, he could not think. He could only stand there, surrounded by the trappings of his respectability, the mahogany table, the velvet curtains, the silver servicer, and feel them turning to dust in his hands. The verdict at the Old Bailey had been final, the judge's words absolute, yet here, in the safety of his own home, the judgment was being retried by every ragged voice in the street. They were stripping him bare, peeling away the layers of his status until there was nothing left but a man who had sent a girl to die to save his own reputation. He crumpled the pamphlet in his fist, the paper resisting for a moment before yielding with a dry crunch. It was not enough. Crushing the words did not make them untrue. He threw the ball of paper towards the fireplace, where a small fire struggled against the morning dampness. It missed the grate, bouncing off the iron fender and landing on the hearth rug, where it sat, white and conspicuous against the wool. He stared at it. To pick it up would be to acknowledge its power. To leave it would be to admit defeat. The conflict tore at him, a physical ache in his gut that twisted with every shout from outside. Another sheet pressed against the window, this one torn at the corner, fluttering like a wounded bird trying to escape. He could see the headline through the glass, the letters blurred but legible. Murder or justice? The question hung there, suspended between the inside and the outside, between the master and the mob. He moved to the window again, his hand hovering over the latch. He wanted to throw it open, to roar at them, to demand they respect the law, to remind them of their place in the order of things. But the words stuck in his throat, choked by the realization that the law was no longer his shield. It had become a weapon turned against him, forged in the very court where he had sought salvation. The noise outside swelled, a tidal wave of sound that vibrated through the floorboards, up through the soles of his shoes and into his bones. It was no longer just hawkers. It was a crowd gathering, coalescing around the story of the girl who would not confess. They were coming to watch her die, yes, but they were also coming to watch him. He could feel their eyes, thousands of them, piercing through the brick and mortar, stripping away the privacy he had assumed was his birthright. There would be no normalcy. No return to the quiet rhythm of meals and accounts and domestic order. The poison had not stayed in the dumplings. It had seeped into the walls, into the air, into the very fabric of his life, and there was no antidote. He turned away from the window, the light from the street casting his shadow long and distorted across the room. It stretched towards the fireplace, towards the crumpled paper on the rug. He walked over to it, his steps heavy, and kicked it into the flames with the toe of his boot. The edges caught immediately, curling and blackening, the ink vanishing into smoke. He watched it burn, the fire consuming the words, the arguments, the accusations, but the heat did not warm him. It only highlighted the coldness that had settled in his marrow. The paper turned to ash, fragile and grey, rising up the chimney to join the soot. But he knew, with a sinking certainty that anchored him to the spot, that the ash would not stay in the grate. It would settle on everything, a fine grey dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove, marking him forever as the man who had bought his peace with a life he could not afford to lose. The fire crackled, a dry, mocking sound, as the last ember died, leaving him standing in the dim room with the roar of the city still pounding in his ears, waiting for a dawn that offered no light. Candlelight did not soften the room. It sharpened the edges of everything, casting long, wavering shadows that made the portraits on the walls seem to lean forward. Turner sat at the head of the mahogany table, the polished surface reflecting the flames like dark water, and forced his hands to rest flat against the wood. They wanted to tremble. He would not allow it. Across from him, Mrs. Turner arranged her napkin with meticulous, brittle folds, her eyes fixed on the plate before her, as if the pattern of the china might offer salvation. Two guests occupied the sides, a barrister named Holloway and a merchant from Cheapside, both men who had known the Turners before the trial, before the pamphlets, before the name Fenning became a currency spent in every gutter from Holborn to the Thames. "Pass the wine, Robert," Holloway said, holding out his glass. Turner reached for the decanter. The glass clinked against the rim, a sharp note that made Mrs. Turner flinch. He poured. The liquid was deep red, thick as blood, filling the silence that tried to form between them. "Good year," the merchant offered, lifting his glass but not drinking. "Acceptable," Turner replied. They ate. The mutton was overcooked, dry and stringy, requiring effort to chew, which suited Turner well enough, for it gave him something to do with his mouth other than speak. Every movement of the servants was weighed. A new girl, brought in from the parish to replace the missing scullery maid, moved around the table with a tray of vegetables, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the plates, yet Turner could feel the guests tracking her progress with their peripheral vision, predators noting the weakness in the herd. When she set down the dish, her hand shook. The silver spoon slid against the ceramic platter. It did not fall, not quite, but the sound was enough. Holloway stopped chewing. The merchant looked down at his own plate, suddenly fascinated by the gravy. Mrs. Turner drew a sharp breath through her nose, a hiss of displeasure that cut through the room more effectively than a shout. The girl froze, her hand hovering over the table, fingers curled around the handle of the serving spoon like a drowning woman clutching a spar. "Continue," Turner said. His voice sounded hollow to his own ears, lacking the authority he had once commanded without effort. The girl nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and retreated towards the sideboard. She did not look at him. None of them did. They were all waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the accusation to be voiced, for the dinner to dissolve into the scandal that hovered just outside the window panes. Turner cut another piece of meat. The knife scraped the plate. He thought of the ash in the fireplace upstairs, the grey dust that would not stay contained. It was here too, in this room, settling on the silver, on the food, on their tongues. "Have you heard," Holloway began, wiping his mouth with the napkin, "that the ordinary refuses to administer the sacrament?" Turner put down his knife. The metal rang against the china. "I have heard many things. They say she remains obstinate, denies the act to the last." "Let her deny it." Turner took a sip of wine, which tasted of iron, before stating that the court has decided. "The court," the merchant murmured, staring into his glass. "Yes, but the people are less convinced than the judge." "What would you have me do?" Turner's voice rose, cracking slightly on the vowel. He lowered it immediately, forcing calm. "I am a victim here. My family was poisoned, my health ruined." "No one disputes the illness, Turner," Holloway said, leaning forward until the candlelight caught the grease on his chin. "But the pamphlets suggest alternatives: contaminated flour, accidental ingestion. They paint you as a man who sacrificed a servant to preserve his own standing." "I sacrificed nothing." "You accused her." She was the cook, and now she dies for it. Holloway sat back, and you dine. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against their chests. The girl returned with the next course, a pudding that no one touched. She moved faster this time, desperate to escape the scrutiny, but her haste made her clumsy. As she turned to leave, her skirt caught the edge of the merchant's chair. She stumbled. The tray tilted. A dollop of suet pudding slid onto the merchant's knee, staining the beige wool of his trousers with dark grease. Clumsy wretch, the merchant snapped, jumping up. It is of no consequence, Turner said, standing. It is ruinous, the merchant countered, dabbing at the stain with a napkin that only spread the grease. This cloth is imported. I shall pay for the cleaning. It is not the cost. The merchant looked at Turner, and for the first time that evening, the mask of politeness slipped. There was disgust there, not at the girl but at the host. It is the atmosphere. One feels so unsafe, as if the poison remains in the house, in the walls. He sat back down, but he did not eat. None of them did. The food cooled on the plates, the fat congealing into white slicks. The servant stood by the wall, shadows among shadows, waiting for permission to clear the tables that no one wished to see again. Turner looked at his wife. She was staring at the door, her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps silent reproach. He could not tell. The distance between them had widened into a chasm no amount of domestic order could bridge. A noise from the street broke the stalemate. It started as a low rumble, like thunder rolling over the city, but there was no storm. It grew louder, a collective voice, thousands of throats opening at once. The guests turned towards the window. The glass vibrated in the frame. "What is that?" Holloway asked. Turner walked to the window. He did not need to open it to know. The sound was distinct, a roar of approval rather than anger. They were not jeering, they were cheering, for her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, doubling him over slightly as he gripped the sill. The mob was not there to witness justice, they were there to witness a martyr. "Turner," Mrs. Turner's voice was small, trembling. He did not answer. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes against the glare of the torches flaring below. The light danced on the ceiling, casting moving shadows that looked like hanging men. The noise swelled, crashing against the brickwork, infiltrating the dining room, drowning out the clatter of cutlery and the whispers of guilt. He had tried to build a wall of respectability around his home, but the sound poured over it like water over a dam. "Who are they cheering?" the merchant asked, standing up now, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Turner turned from the window. His face was pale, the candlelight making him look like a corpse already prepared for the coffin. "Her," he said, "they are cheering for the girl." "That is not possible," Holloway said. "She is a criminal." "She is a story," Turner replied, "and we are merely the paper it is printed on." He walked back to the table and picked up his wine glass. His hand was steady now. The tremor had gone, replaced by a cold resignation that settled in his bones. He drank the wine in one swallow, the heat doing nothing to warm the chill spreading from his stomach. The guests watched him, waiting for a command, an explanation, a denial. He gave them nothing. He simply stood there, surrounded by the untouched food and the staining silence, listening to the city outside celebrate his defeat. The girl by the wall shifted her weight as Turner looked at her, finding her watching him too, with eyes wide, not in fear now, but in a strange, quiet understanding. She knew what the noise meant, just as they all knew. The dinner was over and the performance had ended, leaving only the street, the crowd, and the long walk to the scaffold that waited in the morning light. "Clear the table," Turner said. His voice was flat, devoid of command. The servants moved instantly, relieved to have action, relieved to be moving away from the master who had lost his grip on the room. They gathered the plates, the silver clattering again, but this time the sound did not matter. Nothing mattered but the roar outside, growing louder, closer, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of his shoes. Turner walked to the fireplace and stared into the embers. They were dying. Just like the hope he had carried into the evening, he reached out and touched the cold grate. It burned him not at all. The stone walls of Newgate held the cold like a grudge, seeping into the straw mattress where Eliza sat with her knees drawn to her chest. She had expected the shouting to begin at dawn, a ragged chorus of threats from the debtor's side or the common yard, but this sound arrived fully formed, a tide crashing against the outer bricks. It did not sound like anger. Anger had a sharp edge, a spit of vowels that cut through the air, whereas this was a low, rolling boom that made the iron bars vibrate against the masonry. She lifted her head. The candle on the table sputtered, the flame leaning towards the door as though sucked by the draft of the crowd's breath. "What is it?" she asked. The turnkey did not answer immediately. He stood by the heavy oak door, his hand resting on the keyring that hung from his belt like a weapon. He looked at her, then at the ceiling, as if trying to calculate the weight of the noise pressing down upon them. "They are here for you," he said. "To watch me die." No, he turned the key in the lock, not to open it, but to test the mechanism. "They are calling your name." Eliza stood. Her legs felt stiff, the joints clicking in the damp air, and she walked to the small grated window that looked out onto the yard. She could not see the street, only the slice of sky above the wall, grey and heavy with smoke, but the sound poured through the gap. It was not the hooting of a mob seeking blood. It was a cheer, a sustained, rhythmic approval that rose and fell like the breathing of a giant beast. She gripped the iron bars. The metal was cold, biting into her palms, but she did not let go. This was not the script. The condemned were supposed to be hated, reviled, their names spat upon the cobbles so that their death might cleanse the city. Instead, the city was singing for her. "Why?" she whispered. "Because they like a tragedy," the turnkey said, moving closer until the leather of his boots creaked on the flagstones. "Or because they hate the master. It matters little to them which. It matters to me. Current structure. 1 short, then pray. 2 short/med," he turned back to the door. 3 short, Gurney will be here. "I have nothing to say." "Tell him that." The key turned, the lock clicked. "But know that outside you are already innocent. In here you are still guilty." The door closed. Eliza was alone with the roar. It confused her, this inversion of the world. She had prepared her soul for rejection, for the final loneliness of the scaffold where the crowd's silence was the only mercy offered. Now the noise threatened to drown her resolve just as effectively as the hatred she had expected. If they cheered for her, did they expect her to live? Did they think the rope would break? She looked at her hands. They were clean, scrubbed raw with lye until the skin was red and tender, yet the stain of the accusation remained invisible and permanent. The cheering swelled, a physical pressure against her eardrums, and she stepped back from the window, unable to bear the weight of their approval. It felt like a demand. Across the city, in the quiet of Ormond Street, Robert Turner stood before the hearth where the fire had burned down to a bed of white ash. The noise from the street had faded to a murmur, distant now, separated by miles of brick and shadow, but the vibration remained in the room, trapped within the silence of the dining hall. The guests had departed without ceremony, leaving their coats behind, their faces pale with the discomfort of having witnessed a master's undoing. The table was cleared, the silver polished. The house returned to order, yet nothing was in its proper place. Turner reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the pamphlet. It was creased from being handled, the ink smudged where his thumb had rubbed against the title page. "The innocent victim of perjury." The words stared up at him, accusatory in the dim light. He had bought it from a boy an hour ago, handing over a shilling to see what the world was saying about him, and now he wished he had left the paper in the mud where the boy had dropped it. The edges were soft, the pulp absorbing the moisture from his hand. He held it over the grate. "Robert." He did not turn. Mrs. Turner stood in the doorway, her shadow stretching across the carpet towards him. She wore her dressing gown, the fabric loose around her shoulders, her hair unpinned and falling in grey strands about her face. She looked older than she had that morning, the lines around her mouth deepened by the strain of the dinner, the performance of normalcy that had collapsed under the weight of the crowd's roar. "They are still out there," she said. "It will pass." "Will it?" She stepped into the room. The candlelight caught the tremor in her hands. "They called us murderers, Robert. I heard them through the window. They do not know the truth. They know what they are told." Stopping beside him, she looked down into the ashes. "And what have we told them? That a servant girl poisoned us, that we survived, that she must hang. It is the law. It is a story." She looked at him, her eyes dry and hard. "And stories change." Turner looked at the pamphlet in his hand. The paper was thin, fragile, easily destroyed by a spark. He could burn it. He could feed it to the embers and watch the ink curl into black flakes, erasing the words that accused him of sacrificing a life to save his reputation. But burning it would not change the fact that the words were printed, that hundreds of copies were already drying on presses in the fleet, that the boy who sold it to him would sell another tomorrow. The damage was not in the paper. It was in the air. He told them, Turner said. Who? Holloway, after he spoke to the others, they look at me now as if I am the poison. He moved his hand closer to the grate where heat radiated against his skin, dry and intense. I did what was necessary. Did you? Mrs. Turner turned away. She walked to the window and looked out at the street, where the last of the torches were being extinguished by the watchmen. I do not feel safe, Robert. I look at the servants, and I wonder if they are mixing arsenic into the flour. I look at you, and I wonder if you would sacrifice me to save your name. That is enough. Is it? She did not turn back, for she felt the same chill they felt, the same doubt. Turner dropped the pamphlet into the fire. It caught instantly, the edges blackening and curling inward as the flame consumed the title. He watched the paper shrink, the words innocent victim twisting into illegibility before vanishing into the ash. It gave him no pleasure, no relief, only the confirmation that some things, once spoken, could not be unburned. The heat from the fire washed over his face, but he did not blink. He stood there until the last ember died, leaving only the grey dust that would need to be swept away in the morning. Clear the hearth, he said. He walked out of the room, leaving his wife standing by the window. The house was silent, but the silence was different now. It was not the quiet of order. It was the quiet of a tomb, waiting for the next name to be carved into the stone. He climbed the stairs to his study, the wood creaking under his weight, and closed the door. On the desk lay the warrant for the execution. The ink was dry. The signature was his. He placed his hand upon it, feeling the rough texture of the paper, and waited for the sun to rise. The linen scratched, rough, unbleached fiber biting into the soft skin of her wrist where the cuff had frayed. Eliza rubbed the thumb across the weave, seeking the irregularity of the thread, a tiny lump in the cloth that felt like a stone beneath a sheet. It grounded her. Here was something real, something that existed without permission from the judge or the mob outside the stone walls. The candle on the table guttered, the flame bending low as a draught slipped beneath the iron-bound door, carrying with it the scent of damp straw and old urine that permeated Newgate like a second skin. She did not look at the door. To look was to invite the expectation of it opening, of the turnkey's key grinding in the lock to signal the end of this suspended hour. Instead, she kept her gaze on the flame, watching the black wick curl into the melted tallow, a slow drowning in white fat. The shadow of the flame danced on the wall, elongating and shrinking with each breath of air, mimicking the rise and fall of a chest that might soon be still. Her own breathing was shallow, careful, as if drawing too much air might hasten the morning. Miss Fanning. The voice came through the wood, muffled but distinct, a male voice stripped of warmth. She stiffened, her fingers tightening on the hem of her shift until the knuckles turned white. Are you awake? Yes, her own voice sounded thin, brittle as the dry straw beneath the pallet. The ordinary wishes to know if you require attendance. He waits in the chapel. Tell him no. He says it is for your soul. My soul is my own. She lifted her chin, speaking to the panel of oak as if it were the face of a man. I will not confess to what I did not do, not for God, not for him. There was a pause, a shuffling of boots on the flagstone corridor outside, the sound of weight shifting from one foot to another. The man was tired. They were all tired of this business of dying, of the ritual that demanded a lie to make the execution palatable for the spectators. He says you die hard otherwise. I die honest. The boots shuffled again, then receded, the rhythm of the steps fading down the passage until only the drip of water from a leaking pipe remained to mark the passing of time. Eliza exhaled, a long shuddering breath that emptied her lungs completely before she drew them full again. The candle flame steadied, returning to its upright posture, casting a sharp cone of light onto the table where a crust of bread lay untouched beside a pewter mug. She reached for the bread, not from hunger, but to feel the hardness of it, the resistance of the stale crust against her fingertips. It crumbled slightly, dry particles falling onto the wood, white dust against the dark grain. White dust. The image struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her throat. Flour. The memory of it coated her mind, sudden and vivid, overriding the cold damp of the cell with the phantom heat of the scullery. She could smell it now, the sweet, yeasty scent of the dough rising in the pan, a warm living thing that required patience and care. She had kneaded it until her arms ached, working the mixture until it was smooth, until it held the shape of her hands. It was meant to feed them, to sustain the household that paid her wages, to provide the nourishment expected of a servant who knew her place. Yet that same white powder, when mixed with the wrong substance, became the evidence that hung heavy around her neck. The surgeons had held it up in court, the contaminated dumpling displayed like a relic of sin, the arsenic hidden within the soft interior where no eye could see. She had watched them pass it between their gloved hands, men of science who spoke of grains and compounds while she stood in the dock, her voice drowned by their Latin terms. They had made the domestic lethal. They had taken the tool of her trade and twisted it until the oven's warmth felt indistinguishable from the fever of poisoning. She pushed the bread away. The crust left a smear of flour on the table, a tiny mark that she quickly wiped with her sleeve, the instinct to clean overriding the futility of the act. No amount of scrubbing would remove the stain of the accusation. It was in the air, in the wood, in the very fibers of her shift, which smelled now of the prison rather than the soap she used at Ormond Street. The lie there had reddened her hands. The scalding water used to wash the linens had steamed in the kitchen, but none of it could purge the suspicion that had taken root the moment Mr. Turner fell ill. A rat scrabbled behind the wainscot, a sharp scratching sound that made her flinch. She turned her head towards the noise, tracking the movement in the darkness beyond the candlelight. It was free to move where it pleased, unseen by the turnkeys, unjudged by the court. It would outlive her. It would scurry across these stones long after her body was cut down and carried away in a cart. There was a strange comfort in that thought, a recognition that the world did not stop for the hanging of a servant girl. The city would wake, the shops would open, the carriages would roll over the cobblestones, and the noise of London would swallow the spectacle of her death within the hour. She stood up, the wooden stool scraping against the floor with a harsh shriek that echoed in the small space. Her legs felt heavy, stiff from sitting too long in the cold, but she forced herself to walk the perimeter of the cell. 1 pace, 2 paces, turn. The chain on her ankle rattled, a metallic chime that marked her status more clearly than any verdict. She touched the wall as she passed, the stone cold and damp beneath her palm, condensation gathering on her skin like sweat. It was a solid boundary, a limit to her world that would soon shrink further to the dimensions of a grave. Lord, give me strength. The words slipped out before she could stop them, a whisper lost in the draft. She did not pray often, not since the trial began, for prayer felt like an admission that she needed mercy rather than justice. But the night was long, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, heavy and suffocating. She stopped at the table again, looking down at the candle which had burned lower, the wax pooling around the base like solidified tears. The flame wavered as another draught hit it, threatening to extinguish the light entirely. She cupped her hand around the glass chimney, shielding it from the air. The heat pricked her palm, a small pain that confirmed she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear. She watched the wick burn down, counting the seconds as the flame consumed the fuel, knowing that when it died, the darkness would be absolute until the turnkey returned with the dawn. And when the dawn came, the shadow would point the way. She sat back down, folding her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes. The smell of yeast lingered in her nose, sweet and cloying, masking the scent of the prison for a fleeting moment. It was the last thing she would take from the kitchen, the last memory of the work she had done before the world decided it was murder. She held onto it, tightening her grip on the sensation until it became a shield against the cold. Outside, a bell began to toll, the slow iron sound vibrating through the stone walls to count off the hour. 1, then 2, then 3, as the night wore thin. The iron note decayed. 3 o'clock. The vibration lingered in the masonry longer than the sound itself, a physical shudder that traveled up through the legs of the stool and into her bones. Eliza kept her hands folded, the knuckles white against the dark fabric of her skirts. She spoke to the empty air, testing the weight of the words she had refused to speak in court. "I did not poison them." The voice sounded thin, stripped of the conviction she had felt when the judge sentenced her. It hung in the damp room for a second before the walls swallowed it. She tried again, louder, forcing the air from her lungs until her throat burned. "I am innocent." Still the room offered no echo, no affirmation, just the settled dust and the smell of old straw. She unclasped her hands and rubbed her thumbs together, the skin rough and dry. In the scullery at Ormond Street, her hands had been constantly wet, red from the lye, steaming in the tub where the linens soaked. There the heat had been a constant companion, rising from the copper, from the oven, from the bodies of the family she served. Here the cold seeped through the soles of her shoes, a damp chill that no fire could touch. "They made it poison." She said it to the candle. The flame dipped, reacting to the breath of her accusation, then steadied. It was not the arsenic that killed her, but the fear that sat around the dinner table like an uninvited guest. Mr. Turner had been ill before the dumplings arrived. She had seen the pallor on his cheek when she poured his beer, the way his hand trembled reaching for the spoon. But illness in a master was a disruption, a chaos that demanded order, and order required a culprit. A servant would do. A servant was expendable. "You knew," she whispered to the shadow in the corner. "Mrs. Turner, you knew he was sick." The mistress's face floated in the gloom, sharp-featured and pinched, the way it had looked when the doctors arrived. She had not looked at Eliza then. She had looked at the doctors, at the magistrates, at the men who held the power to decide what was true. Eliza had stood by the hearth, flour on her apron, waiting for a question that never came. They did not want the truth. They wanted a vessel for their terror. The dough was soft, pliable, easily shaped. So was she. A draft shifted the curtain over the door. Eliza flinched, her head snapping towards the movement, but it was only the air settling. She stood again, the joints in her knees cracking in the quiet. Walking helped. Movement kept the blood from stagnating, kept the mind from circling the same dark hole. She paced the length of the cell, 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. The chain on her ankle dragged, a heavy iron weight that chafed the skin raw. 5 steps to the wall, 5 steps to the grave. She laughed, a dry, humorless sound that caught in her throat. It was not funny, nothing about this was funny, but the absurdity of it, the sheer mechanics of a life reduced to a count of footsteps, demanded some reaction. She stopped at the table and ran a finger through the pooled wax. It was still soft, warm from the burn. She rolled it between her thumb and forefinger, shaping it into a ball, a dumpling, white, round, harmless. "They will say I confessed," she said to the wax ball. "Gurney will write it down." The ordinary had visited her that afternoon, his face lined with a pity that felt like condescension. He wanted her to save her soul, he said. He wanted her to admit the sin so that God could forgive her before the rope took her breath. But to admit the sin was to admit the crime. To repent was to lie. She had shaken her head, watching the frustration tighten the muscles in his jaw. He needed her confession more than she needed his absolution. It was the only way the machinery could rest, knowing the sinner had acknowledged the justice of the hangman. "I will not lie for them." She crushed the wax ball. It flattened under her thumb, losing its shape, becoming a smear of grey on the wood. That was all she was to them now, a smear, a necessary stain to be wiped away so the household could function again. The Turners would recover. Mr. Turner would eat another dinner. Mrs. Turner would hire another girl, one who would keep her head down and scrub the linens until her hands bled. The kitchen would smell of yeast again. The oven would warm the room. Life would continue, smooth and unbroken, as if Eliza Fenning had never existed. She wiped the wax on her shift, leaving a greasy mark on the linen. It would not wash out, another stain. She looked down at it, a dark patch against the coarse grey fabric. Let it stay. There was a power in that, small as it was, to leave a mark, to refuse the cleaning. The turnkey's boots clumped in the corridor outside, heavy and slow, pausing briefly at her door before moving on. He did not come in. He knew she was awake. They all knew. The night staff watched the condemned like hawks, waiting for the break, the sob, the plea for mercy that would justify their wages. She gave them nothing. She walked back to the stool and sat, the wood creaking under her weight. The candles sputtered. The wick was drowning in the wax, the flame shrinking to a blue pinpoint. She did not trim it, let it die. The darkness was coming regardless. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and closed her eyes. The yeast smell was gone now, replaced by the scent of tallow and damp stone. It was better this way. The memory of the kitchen was too sharp, too painful. It reminded her of what she had lost, not just life, but the ordinary rhythm of labor that she had once found tedious. She would give anything for the ache in her shoulders from kneading, for the burn of the scullery water. Sleep, she commanded herself. Her body resisted, the muscles in her back tight and coiled like the rope that waited in the yard. She forced them to loosen, one group at a time. Shoulders drop, jaw unclench while hands rest. It was a discipline like any other. She had learned to work when tired and to scrub when her fingers were cracked. Now she could learn to rest when the world demanded she fear. The darkness behind her eyelids was not empty. Shapes moved there, indistinct, shadowy forms that shifted when she tried to focus. She did not try to focus, she let them drift. The bell tolled again, distant now, perhaps from another church, another hour. Or perhaps it was only in her head. It did not matter. The count was done. The night was wearing thin, and the dawn would bring the shadow that pointed the way. She breathed in, slow and deep, filling her lungs with the cold air of the cell. Enough! The word was a whisper, final as a seal. She slumped forward, her head resting on her folded arms on the table. The wood was hard against her cheek, unyielding. It was the last solid thing she would feel for a long time. Her breathing slowed, the rhythm of it changing from the shallow gasps of anxiety to the deeper pull of exhaustion. The candle flame flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the cell into a blackness so complete it felt like water. She did not open her eyes. She let the dark take her, knowing that when she woke, the walking would be done. Darkness pressed. It had weight, a physical mass that settled in her chest and made the breathing laborious, each inhale a negotiation with the void. She drifted through a landscape where the floor dropped away without warning, leaving her suspended in a void that smelled of old straw and unwashed bodies. There was no ground, only the sensation of falling, endless and vertiginous, until the jerk came. The rope caught her, but it was not hemp. In the dream, the noose around her neck was not dead fiber, but a living thing, scaling itself against her skin with cold friction of a snake waking from winter sleep, tightening not with the jerk off the drop, but with the slow, muscular constriction of a predator securing its meal. SSSH. She tried to push it away, her hands clawing at the air, but her fingers met only slick scales that hissed back at her, a sound like steam escaping a kettle. The coils tightened, her lungs burned, the air refused to enter. Let go! The command tore from her throat, ragged and loud in the small space, but the dream held her fast, dragging her down into the earth where the roots of the gallows waited to drink her blood. She kicked out, her heels striking the leg of the stool with a sharp crack that echoed like a pistol shot, and the pain dragged her back to the surface. Eliza gasped, the air tearing at her throat like a saw, her body jerking upright as the chain on her ankle rattled against the iron ring bolted to the floor. The sound was metallic, harsh, and utterly real. She clutched the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood until the splinters pierced her skin, grounding her in the texture of the cell. Only wood. Her voice shook. It was a child's whisper, trembling in the blackness. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the cool surface of the table, waiting for the hammering in her ribs to settle into a rhythm that did not promise immediate death. Sweat soaked the linen of her shift, clinging to her back like a wet shroud, and she shivered though the air was still. The dream lingered in her muscles, a phantom tension that made her hands curl into fists as if still fighting the snake. She unclenched them, one finger at a time, forcing the tendons to relax. It is only a dream. Is it? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Her body did not believe her. The pulse in her neck throbbed where the rope would sit, a tender, throbbing spot that felt bruised despite the absence of any cord. She rubbed the skin there, her fingertips finding nothing but the warm, living flesh of her own throat, yet the sensation of constriction remained. It was a betrayal. Her mind had made its peace, had walked the path to the end, and accepted the necessity of the drop, but her flesh remained stubborn, animalistic, refusing to walk quietly into the slaughter. Damn you! She spoke to her own hands, lying pale on the table. They trembled. She slapped them down hard, the sting sharp and immediate. The pain helped. It cleared the fog of the dream, replacing the phantom snake with the real ache of the blow. She sat back, the stool creaking under her weight, and listened to the silence of the jail. It was not truly silent. There were sounds if one cared to hear them. The scuttle of a rat in the corner, busy with some unseen business. The distant cough of a prisoner 2 cells down, wet and racked with consumption. The wind moving through the yard, whistling low against the brickwork. Busy even now. The rat stopped. She could feel its eyes on her, 2 bright beads in the dark, assessing whether she was food or threat. She did not move. Let it look. They would all be looking soon enough. The turnkeys, the sheriffs, the crowd that would pack the streets around Horsemonger Lane until the cobblestones were invisible beneath their boots. They would watch her die to make sure the justice was done, to ensure the spectacle satisfied their hunger for order. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, the motion weary. I will not give them the spectacle they want. No crying. No begging. She stated it like a rule, a regulation to be followed as strictly as any instruction from Mrs. Turner regarding the polishing of silver. There was a comfort in rules, even those she had made for herself. They provided a structure to the chaos, a way to impose will upon a situation where will mattered little. She stood up, the chain dragging with a heavy scrape that made the rat skitter away into the shadows. Her legs felt weak, the muscles unsteady after the violence of the dream, but she forced them to hold her weight. Walking helped. It circulated the blood. It kept the stiffness from settling in the joints. 5 steps. She paced the length of the cell again, counting strides as before even though the darkness made distances hard to judge. 1, 2. When her hand met the wall, cold and damp with condensation, she turned. 3, 4. The table struck her hip at 5. It was a small world bounded by stone and iron, shrinking with every passing hour until it would become nothing more than the box of a coffin. Stopping in the center of the room, she looked up, though she could see nothing of the ceiling. Will it be quick? Nobody answered. The question was for God or perhaps for the hangman, neither of whom were inclined to share their schedules with the condemned. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to contain the shaking that had started in her hands and spread to her shoulders. It was cold. The night was turning, the deepest hour before the morning breaking. She could feel it in the air, a shift in the pressure, a lightening of the blackness that was not yet light, but the promise of it. Stay still. She commanded her body again, but the trembling persisted, a vibration deep in the bone that no amount of will could suppress. It was fear, plain and simple. To deny it would be another lie, and she was done with lying. She was afraid. She did not want to die. The desire to live was a stubborn weed that grew even in the shadow of the gallows, sending out shoots despite the lack of sun. Acknowledging it did not make her weak. It made her human. I am afraid. The admission cost her nothing, yet it felt like a burden lifted. She sat down again, the wood hard beneath her, and waited as grey began to seep into the cell, not as a color but as a texture that turned the blackness into a dull, heavy charcoal. Objects emerged from the gloom, the table scarred and stained, the stool, leg uneven, the door iron-bound and solid. And the shadows stretched long across the floor, cast by the faint light filtering through the high grate, pointing invariably towards the exit. Look! The shadows pointed the way. There was no ambiguity in them. They led from the cell to the corridor, from the corridor to the yard, from the yard to the cart, a map drawn in darkness. She traced the line with her eyes, following the path her feet would take in a few hours. It was a straight line, no turns, no deviations. The geometry of her ending was already laid out on the stone flags. Then let us go. She stood as the light strengthened, grey and indifferent, illuminating the wax stain on her shift. It looked like a bruise. She touched it one last time, feeling the greasy hardness of the cooled tallow. A mark. She would leave it there. The turnkey's key grated in the lock outside, the sound loud and final in the quiet morning. She did not turn to face the door. She kept her eyes on the shadow that pointed the way. The iron hinge screamed, a high, thin shriek that cut through the quiet of the cell just as the key had promised. Light, grey and blunt, struck her face like a physical blow, forcing her to squint against the sudden intrusion of the morning. Stand! The turnkey stood in the frame, a block of shadow against the brighter corridor, his bulk filling the space where the freedom of the hallway began. He did not offer a hand. Hands were for helping, and this was not help. Eliza rose, the iron shackles on her ankles clinking together with a dull, metallic chime that echoed off the damp walls of the cell. She stepped forward. The stone floor was slick with condensation, cold enough to bite through the thin leather of her shoes, and she stumbled slightly as the weight of the leg irons pulled at her stride. "Mind the step." The turnkey moved aside, letting her pass into the corridor where the air smelled of stale tobacco and the lingering sourness of unwashed bodies. They walked, boots scraped on flagstones, iron dragged, a rhythm of condemnation. Other cells held men who shouted blessings or curses as the procession passed, their voices bouncing off the brickwork, but Eliza kept her gaze fixed on the back of the turnkey's coat, a dull brown wool that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. She did not answer the prayers. She did not acknowledge the jeers. Her silence was a shield, thin and brittle, but the only armor she possessed against the machinery of the state. The corridor opened into the yard. Wind hit them. It carried the scent of coal smoke from the surrounding chimneys, thick and acrid, mixing with the damp earth smell of the prison grounds. "Hold!" The sheriff stood near the gate, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his breath pluming in front of him like steam from a kettle. He checked a pocket watch, the gold chain glinting briefly before he snapped the casing shut. "Is the cart ready?" "Waiting, sir." "Then bring her out." The gate groaned open. Beyond the wall, the noise hit her first, a low, vibrating roar that seemed to come from the ground itself rather than the throats of men. She stepped through. Horsemonger Lane was packed, faces pressed against the railings, white and eager, stacked row upon row like bricks in a kiln, their eyes fixed on the scaffold that stood stark against the sky. Hundreds, thousands. The sheer scale of them blinded her, a sea of hats and bonnets that stretched back into the streets until the buildings were lost in the haze of humanity. She stopped breathing for a second. The air was thick with the vapor of their exhalations, a cloud of white breath hanging in the cold morning air, visible as if the crowd itself were a single living beast exhaling warmth into winter. "Keep moving." The turnkey nudged her elbow, his grasp firm but not unkind, guiding her towards the wooden steps thatched up to the platform. Eliza lifted her foot. The iron dragged. She placed it on the first step. Wood creaked. The sound was loud in sudden lull of the crowd, a sharp crack that signaled the beginning of the end. She looked up. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of clouds, offering no shelter from the gaze of the people who had come to watch her die. "Do not look at them," the turnkey muttered, his voice low, meant only for her ears amidst the gathering silence. "Look at her beam." She did not look at her beam. She looked at her sky. It was safer. The crowd began to murmur, a sound like wind rushing through dry leaves as she ascended higher, leaving the ground and the safety of the earth behind. Her legs trembled, not from fear, from the weight of the irons. She told herself this. It was a lie, but a necessary one, a small fiction to keep her spine straight as she reached the top of the platform. The sheriff nodded. The executioner waited. He held the rope. It coiled in his hands like a sleeping snake, dark hemp that had killed before and would kill again. Eliza stood still. The wind caught the shift, pressing the linen against the legs, cold and clinging. She thought of the dumplings, white flour, water, yeast, simple things, things that fed life. Now she stood on a platform built for death, the wood rough beneath her feet, the air thin and sharp. "Ready?" The sheriff asked the question, though he did not expect an answer. Eliza said nothing. Her throat was dry, the silencer stretched. It was not empty, it was heavy. It weighed more than the irons, it weighed more than the rope. It was the weight of all words she would never speak, piled up against her chest until breathing became a labor. The executioner stepped forward. His boots scuffed the wood. He raised the cap, white cotton, blindingly bright against the gray of the day. "Lord have mercy," someone whispered in the crowd, the words carrying clearly on the still air. Eliza closed her eyes. She did not want their mercy, she wanted the truth, but that truth was a luxury she no longer afforded. The cap descended. Darkness returned, not the grey off the cell, not the black off the night. A final, absolute shutting out of the world. She felt the hemp touch her neck. Rough, cold, real. "Wait, I went too far again. I need to stop before the cap. Beat 2 is climbing and turning. Beat 1 is the crowd and arrival. I must cut the execution itself." Revision cut from ready onwards. Extend the crowd observation and the physical sensation of the climb to fill the word count. Focus on the visual of the hats and the breath. Revised ending. End as she stands on the platform, looking out, before the executioner moves in. Hook to beat 2, turning to face them. Let's rewrite the second half to expand and stop correctly. Let's keep moving. The turnkey nudged her elbow, his grasp firm but not unkind, guiding her towards the wooden steps that led up Toth's platform. Eliza lifted her foot. The iron dragged. Shep placed it on the first step. Wood creaked. The sound was loud in the sudden lull of the crowd. A sharp crack that signaled the beginning of Theend. She looked up. Thesky was a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of clouds, offering no shelter from the gaze of the people who had come to watch her die. "Do not look at them," the turnkey muttered, his voice low, meant only for hearers amidst the gathering silence. "Look at the beam." She did not look at the beam, she looked at the sky. It was safer. The crowd began to murmur, a sound like wind rushing through dry leaves. As ascended higher, leaving the ground and the safety of the earth behind. Her legs trembled, not from fear, from thewate of the irons. Shet told herself this. It was a lie, but a necessary one, a small fiction to keep her spine straight. As she reached the top of the platform, the sheriff nodded. The executioner waited Toth's side, hands clasped behind his back, watching her with detached interest of a craftsman waiting for the wood to dry. Eliza stood still. Thewin caught her shift, pressing the linen against her legs, cold and clinging. She thought of the dumplings, white flour, water, yeast, simpler things, things that fed life. Nosh stood on a platform built for death, the wood rough beneath her feet, the air thin and sharp. "Steady now." The sheriff stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the planks. He glanced at her crowd, then back at her, his face a mask of official indifference. "You have the opportunity to speak. Toss your piece before Theend." Eliza shook her head. The emotion was small, barely perceptible. "I have said what I know. It is your last chance. I am innocent." The words came out flat, devoid of the passion the crowd expected, devoid of the drama that would have satisfied their hunger for a scene. The sheriff sighed, a short puff of air that vanished instantly. "So be it." He stepped back, the executioner moved forward but did not yet raise the rope. Eliza turned. She faced the people. The sea off had seemed to swell, pressing against the barriers as if they might surge forward and take her by force. Their breath hung in the air, visible clouds of white that mingled with the smoke from the chimneys behind them. She saw faces, some wept, some cheered, most just watched, their mouths opened slightly, hungry for Thedrop. The noise returned, a low rumble that vibrated in soles of her shoes. She gripped the railing. Theward was smooth, worn down by the hands of those who had stood here before. Her knuckles turned white. Theckled bit into her fingers. She did not let go. The executioner waited behind her, a shadow lengthening on the boards. He cleared his throat. The sound was loud. It marked the end of the delay. The time for speaking was done. The time for breathing was nearly over. She fixed her eyes on the horizon, where the roofs of London stretched out in a jagged line of brick and mortar. There was no freedom there. There was only the city. It watched her, she watched it. The executioner stepped closer. The rope swung gently in his hand. The hemp brushed against the arm. Rough, cold, real, the trapdoor lay beneath her feet, a square of darkness in the wood. She could see the hinges, she could see the mechanism. It was a simple thing, a lever, alright, a fall, nothing more. The crowd held its breath. The wind died, the world waited. She did not look down, she looked at Thesky. It was the only thing left that did not want something from her. The executioner raised the cap. White cotton, blindingly bright, he stepped in. The shadow fell over her face. The light vanished. The last thing she saw was the grey, then nothing. "Wait, I still went too far. The hook for beat 2 is the trapdoor is sprung. Beat 1 must end before the drop. Beat 2 is the climb and turn. Beat 3 is the noose and sky. Beat 1 is the yard and crowd. I need to end beat 1 as she reaches the platform or starts the climb. Let's align with the skeleton exactly." Skeleton beat 1, led out into yard, blinded by crowd. Skeleton beat 2, climbs steps, turns to face people. Skeleton beat 3, executioner adjusts noose, closes eyes. Ending hook, trapdoor sprung. Okay, beat 1 must end before she climbs, or as she starts. Let's end as she approaches the scaffold base, looking up at it. Rewriting the ending of beat one to match. Steady now. The sheriff stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the gravel. He glanced at her crowd, then back other, his face a mask of official indifference. You have the opportunity to speak. Tosse your piece before themed. Eliza shook her head. The emotion was small, barely perceptible. I have said what I know. It is your last chance. I am innocent. The words came out flat, devoid of the passion the crowd expected, devoid of the drama that would have satisfied their hunger for a scene. The sheriff sighed, a short puff of air that vanished instantly. So be it. He stepped back. The executioner moved to the side, hands clasped behind his back, watching her with detached interest of a craftsman waiting for the wood to dry. Eliza stood still. Thew Ind caught her shift, pressing linen against her legs, cold and clinging. She thought of the dumplings, white flour, yeast, simpler things, things that fed life. Osh stood on the gravel off the yard, the wood rough Beniath scaffold, the air thin and sharp. Move her up. The order came from the sheriff, sharp and final. The turnkey grip at her arm. Eliza lifted her foot. The iron dragged. She placed it on the first step. Wood creaked. The sound was loud in the sudden lull of the crowd, a sharp crack that signaled the beginning of the end. She looked up. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of clouds, offering no shelter from the gaze of the people who had come to watch her die. The scaffold loomed. It was higher than she had imagined. The beams crossed overhead, black against the light. A cage, a trap, a mouth waiting to close. She put her foot on the next step, her leg shook. The iron pulled, she did not stop. The crowd watched. Every eye was fixed on her back. She could feel it, a physical weight, pressing against her spine. She climbed one step, then another. The wood groaned under her weight. The world tilted. The ground fell away. The sky grew larger. The faces became smaller. She reached the top. The platform was small, bare. Exposed, the wind hit her full force. She turned. The crowd roared, a sound like the sea. She did not flinch. She stood still. The executioner waited. The rope hung. The end was here. This is too staccato at the end. I need to fix the rhythm and ensure I don't run into beat 2's territory too much. Beat 1 ends with the hook to the next beat. The hook should be the start of the climb or the view of the scaffold. Let's aim to end as she faces the scaffold, about to climb. Final plan. 1 cell exit. 2 corridor. 3 yard crowd reveal. 4 approach scaffold. 5 end as she looks at the steps. The iron hinge screamed, a high, thin shriek that cut through the quiet of the cell just as the key had promised. Light, grey and blunt, struck her face like a physical blow, forcing her to squint against the sudden intrusion of the morning. Stand. The turnkey stood in the frame, a block of shadow against the brighter corridor, his bulk filling the space where the freedom of the hallway began. He did not offer a hand. Hands were for helping, and this was not help. Eliza rose, the iron shackles on her ankles clinking together with a dull, metallic chime that echoed off the damp walls of the cell. She stepped forward. The stone floor was slick with condensation, cold enough to bite through the thin leather of her shoes, and she stumbled slightly as the weight of the leg irons pulled at her stride. Mind the step. The turnkey moved aside, letting her pass into the corridor where the air smelled of stale tobacco and the lingering sourness of unwashed bodies. They walked, boots scraped on flagstones, iron dragged, a rhythm of condemnation. Other cells held men who shouted blessings or curses as the procession passed, their voices bouncing off the brickwork, but Eliza kept her gaze fixed on the back of the turnkey's coat, a dull brown wool that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. She did not answer the prayers. She did not acknowledge the jeers. Her silence was a shield, thin and brittle, but the only armor she possessed against the machinery of the state. The corridor opened into the yard. Wind hit them. It carried the scent of coal smoke from the surrounding chimneys, thick and acrid, mixing with the damp earth smell of the prison grounds. Hold! The sheriff stood near the gate, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his breath pluming in front of him like steam from a kettle. He checked a pocket watch, the gold chain glinting briefly before he snapped the casing shut. Is the cart ready? Waiting, sir. Then bring her out. The gate groaned open. Beyond the wall, the noise hit her first, a low, vibrating roar that seemed to come from the ground itself rather than the throats of men. She stepped through. Horsemonger Lane was packed, faces pressed against the railings, white and eager, stacked row upon row like bricks in a kiln, their eyes fixed on the scaffold that stood stark against the sky. Hundreds, thousands. The sheer scale of them blinded her, a sea of hats and bonnets that stretched back into the streets until the buildings were lost in the haze of humanity. She stopped breathing for a second. The air was thick with the vapor of their exhalations, a cloud of white breath hanging in the cold morning air, visible as if the crowd itself were a single living beast exhaling warmth into the winter. "Keep moving." The turnkey nudged her elbow, his grasp firm but not unkind, guiding her towards the wooden steps that led up to the platform. Eliza lifted her foot. The iron dragged. She placed it on the first step. Wood creaked. The sound was loud in the sudden lull of the crowd, a sharp crack that signaled the beginning of the end. She looked up. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of clouds, offering no shelter from the gaze of the people who had come to watch her die. "Do not look at them," the turnkey muttered, his voice low, meant only for her ears amidst the gathering silence. "Look at the beam." She did not look at the beam. She looked at the sky. It was safer. The crowd began to murmur, a sound like wind rushing through dry leaves as she ascended higher, leaving the ground and the safety of the earth behind. Her legs trembled, not from fear, from the weight of the irons. She told herself this. It was a lie, but a necessary one, a small fiction to keep her spine straight as she reached the top of the platform. The sheriff nodded. The executioner waited to the side, hands clasped behind his back, watching her with the detached interest of a craftsman waiting for the wood to dry. Eliza stood still. The wind caught her shift, pressing the linen against her legs, cold and clinging. She thought of the dumplings, white flour, water, yeast, simple things, things that fed life. Now she stood on the gravel of the yard, the wood rough beneath the scaffold, the air thin and sharp. "Move her up." Order came from the sheriff, sharp and final. The turnkey gripped her arm. Eliza lifted her foot. The chain scraped against the wood, a harsh, grating sound that made the front row of the crowd flinch. She looked at the steps. They were steep, unforgiving, each one a judgment. She placed her foot on the first rung. The wood held. She pulled herself up. The crowd watched. Every eye was fixed on her back. She could feel it, a physical weight, pressing against her spine. She climbed, one step, then another. The wood groaned under her weight. The world tilted. The ground fell away. The sky grew larger. The faces became smaller. She reached the top. The platform was small, bare, exposed. The wind hit her full force. She turned. The crowd roared, a sound like the sea. She did not flinch. She stood still. The executioner waited. The rope hung. The end was here. The roar broke, then fractured, dissolving into a hush that pressed against the eardrums harder than the noise had done. It was not the quiet of an empty room, nor the peace of a chapel after prayer, but a held breath, a collective suspension of life among the thousands packed into the lane below. Eliza stood upon the planks, the wind finding the gaps in her shift, chilling the skin where the linen clung damply to her spine. She had expected stones. She had prepared herself for the volley of curses, the spit of the mob that viewed her death as a holiday, a carnival of justice where the main attraction was the snapping of a neck. Instead, the silence waited. It possessed weight. It leaned upon the scaffold like a physical thing, heavy and wet, smelling of wool and unwashed bodies and the coal smoke that drifted from the surrounding chimneys in grey ribbons. "Stand fast." The turnkey's voice was rough, stripped of the muttering kindness he had shown in the corridor. He stood to her left, his hand hovering near her elbow but not touching, ready to steady her should her legs give way, though he knew they would not. Pride was a stubborn fuel, and it burned hotter than fear now. Eliza shifted her weight. The iron shackles grated against the wood, a harsh, scraping sound that echoed out into the void of the crowd, loud as a pistol shot in a library. She did not look down. To look down was to acknowledge the drop, the void beneath the trapdoor that waited to swallow her whole. She kept her chin level. Her gaze swept the sea of faces. There were men in top hats, standing shoulder to shoulder with laborers in smocks, all unified in this single act of witnessing. Women held children aloft, small heads bobbing above the press, eyes wide and uncomprehending of the theater they attended. She searched for hatred. She found none, only curiosity. 1,000 pairs of eyes dissecting her, stripping the flesh from the bone in anticipation, yet devoid of the malice she had braced for in the cell. It was worse. Malice she could understand, it was a language she spoke. This reverence was alien. It made her a monument before she was dead, carving her into history while the blood still rushed warm in her veins. "Is it time?" The sheriff stepped forward, the gold chain of his watch catching the pale light. He did not look at Eliza. He looked at the sky, measuring the sun's position against the rooftops of Southwark. "Near enough," the sheriff said. "The clergyman is ready." "Waiting in the cart, sir." "Then we do not keep him waiting." The turnkey nodded, a sharp dip of the chin. He moved behind her. Eliza heard the rustle of his coat, the creak of leather boots shifting on the timber. She wanted to speak. The words sat on her tongue, hard and dry, demanding release. "I am innocent." The phrase had become a reflex, a heartbeat of its own, but she swallowed it back. To speak now was to beg. To beg was to admit the power they held over her soul. She would not give them the satisfaction of a plea. The silence was hers. She would keep it until the rope took it from her. A pigeon landed on the beam above. It cooed, a soft, guttural sound that seemed obscene in the stillness. The bird preened its wing, indifferent to the gathering below, indifferent to the woman standing beneath the shadow of the wood. Eliza watched it. For a second she envied the creature. It could fly away. It could lift into the grey expanse and leave the lane, the scaffold, the watching eyes behind. She remained rooted. The iron on her ankles bit into the skin, a cold circle of pain that grounded her to the spot. "Do you wish to say anything?" The turnkey asked the question quietly, a final offer extended in the space between them. It was not required by law. It was a courtesy, a scrap of humanity thrown to the condemned before the machinery engaged. Eliza turned her head slightly. She looked at him. His face was lined, weathered by the damp of Newgate, eyes that had seen too many ends to count them all. "No," she said. Her voice was thin, carried away by the wind before it could reach the crowd. "I have said all." "Very well." He stepped back. The sheriff consulted his watch again, snapping the case shut with a click that resonated through the platform. The sound triggered a ripple in the crowd, a murmur that ran through the ranks like wind through grass, but it did not break the overall hush. They were waiting for the drop. They wanted the physics of it, the finality of the fall. Eliza closed her eyes. She thought of the kitchen at Ormond Street, the heat of the oven. The smell of yeast rising in the warm air, a scent of life, of sustenance, of mornings where the only worry was whether the bread would brown evenly. Now the white powder was associated only with death. The flour of the dumplings, the arsenic of the verdict, the lime of the grave, all white, all indistinguishable until the body reacted. "Steady now." The executioner moved into her peripheral vision. He wore a mask, a dark cowl that hid his features, turning him into a function rather than a man. He carried the cap, white linen, designed to blindfold her to spare the crowd the sight of her dying face, though everyone knew it was to spare them the guilt of seeing it. Eliza flinched as he approached, an involuntary twitch of the shoulder, but she did not step back. There was nowhere to step. The edge of the platform was behind her heels. One step back, and she would be gone before the rope tightened. "Miss Fanning." The sheriff addressed her directly for the first time. His voice was formal, detached, the voice of a man reading a notice of eviction. "You understand the necessity of this procedure." "I understand," she said. "Then God have mercy on your soul." "God knows the truth," she replied. The words came out sharper than she intended, cutting through the damp air. "That must be enough." The sheriff did not answer. He turned away, signaling to the executioner. The moment for conversation was over. The ritual demanded progress. The executioner raised the cap. The linen hung limp in his hands, a ghost of a garment. Eliza looked past him, past the scaffold, to the sliver of sky visible between the rooftops. It was clearing. The clouds were breaking, revealing a patch of blue so pale it was almost white. She fixed her eyes on it. She would not let them cover her vision. She would meet the end with her eyes open, watching the sky until the dark took her. The executioner paused. He waited for her to bow her head, to submit to the blinding. She did not move. The standoff lasted only a heartbeat, but in the stillness of the lane, it felt like an hour. The crowd sensed the resistance. The murmur died completely. Even the pigeon flew off, startled by the tension, wings beating loudly against the quiet. "Leave it," the sheriff said suddenly. His voice was low, barely audible, but the executioner heard. "If she will not take it, leave it." The executioner lowered the cap. He stepped back to the lever. The wood groaned as his weight shifted. Eliza felt the change in the air, the sudden intake of breath from the thousands below, a suction of hope and horror mixed together. She stood tall. The wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her cheek, stinging the skin. She did not brush it away. She let it lie there, a final sensation of the living world. The turnkey moved to the side, clearing the space. His face turned away, unable to watch the final mechanics of his duty. "Ready." The executioner's voice was muffled behind the cowl. Eliza did not answer. There was no need. Her stance was the answer. Her silence was the confession they would never extract. The lever waited. The trap waited. The world tilted on its axis, balancing on the edge of a wooden door. She thought of the dumplings one last time, the yeast, the arsenic, the indistinguishable white powders that had brought her here. She breathed in. The air tasted of coal and salt and the iron tang of the river nearby. "No." The word was not spoken aloud. It was felt. A signal passed between the men. The lever moved. The mechanism clicked. The wood beneath her feet shuddered, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of her shoes into the bones, settling in the teeth. The trapdoor waited, poised on the knife edge of release. The sky above remained blue, indifferent, unchanging. The silence broke, not with a roar, but with the sharp, dry crack of the spring releasing, and the world dropped away. The sheriff's words hung there, a formal blessing that offered no salvation. He turned his back, a dismissal. The executioner stepped forward again, the leather of his boots creaking against the wooden planks, a sound dry and intimate in the stillness. He held the noose, hemp, coarse, twisted fibers that looked like rope but felt like wire against the skin. Eliza did not flinch when the man reached for her neck, though her shoulders tightened, a reflexive armoring against the touch of a stranger who would soon be the agent of her end. The hemp scratched, rough, unyielding. It smelled of the warehouse, of dust and old salt, nothing like the clean linen of her own collar. "Steady." The voice came from behind the cowl, muffled, impersonal. He adjusted the knot, positioning it behind her left ear, the standard placement to ensure the spine snapped rather than the strangling taking hold. A mercy, perhaps, in its own brutal arithmetic. Eliza kept her chin up. To lower it would be to accept the cap, to admit she could not bear the sight of what came next. She would not give them that satisfaction. The crowd below shifted, a single organism breathing in unison, thousands of lungs drawing air that she would soon cease to use. She could feel their gaze, physical, heavy. It pressed against her cheeks like a wind. She looked up. Above the scaffold, above the black coats and the bowed hats of the officials, the sky opened, a patch of pale blue, fractured by the jagged geometry of the rooftops. Chimney pots lined the horizon like sentinels, dark silhouettes against the light. Smoke drifted from a nearby hearth, thin and gray, dissolving into the ether before it could reach her. It was an ordinary morning. The birds were singing. Somewhere a cart wheel clattered on the cobblestones, a mundane sound that belonged to a world of commerce and continuation, not this suspended moment of ending. The contrast sharpened the edge of her reality. She was here. They were there. The divide was absolute. "Miss Fanning." The sheriff spoke again, not turning around. He addressed the air, the procedure, rather than the woman. "You have the opportunity. A final confession clears the conscience." "I am innocent." The words did not shout. They did not need to. They landed on the wood between them, solid as a stone. The sheriff's shoulders stiffened, a slight movement visible beneath the wool of his coat. He had expected compliance. They always expected compliance. The ritual required the condemned to admit guilt, to validate the justice of the crowd, to make the death a moral lesson rather than a murder. She denied them the lesson. She denied them the peace of a resolved narrative. "Leave it." The sheriff's command was sharp. The executioner paused, the white linen cap dangling from his hand. He had waited for her to bow, to submit to the blinding. She remained upright, her eyes fixed on that sliver of blue. The executioner lowered the cloth. He stepped back towards the lever, his movements slow, deliberate, giving the moment weight. The wood groaned under his shift in balance. A structural complaint. The platform vibrated, a low hum that traveled up through the soles of her shoes. Eliza breathed in. The air tasted of coal, of the river, of the damp wool of the crowd below. She thought of the kitchen at Ormond Street, the heat of the oven, the smell of yeast rising in the warm air, a scent of life, of sustenance, of mornings where the only worry was whether the bread would brown evenly. Now the white powder was associated only with death. The flour of the dumplings, the arsenic of the verdict, the lime of the grave, all white, all indistinguishable until the body reacted. Her hands hung at her sides, the fingers twitched once, a phantom sensation of kneading dough, of working the substance that had brought her here. She had fed them, they had eaten, they had sickened, and she was to die for the biology of it, for the invisible contaminant that no eye could see until the stomach turned. "Ready." The executioner's voice was a question without expectation. He knew the answer. The mechanism waited. The trapdoor beneath her feet was a secret mouth waiting to swallow. Eliza did not answer. There was no need. Her stance was the answer. Her silence was the confession they would never extract. She looked at the sky one last time. The blue was fading, a cloud drifting across to obscure the light. A grey shadow passed over her face. She did not blink. The lever moved. A click, metal on metal. The sound was small, insignificant against the scale of the crowd, but it triggered the violence. The wood beneath her feet shuddered, a vibration that traveled up through the bone, settling in the teeth. The trapdoor waited, poised on the knife edge of release. The sky above remained grey, indifferent, unchanging. The silence broke, not with a roar but with the sharp, dry crack of the spring releasing. The floor vanished. Gravity took hold. The world tilted violently, the horizon spinning into a blur of wood and sky and faces, the sound of her own breathing instantly replaced by the rush of blood in her ears. The rope tightened, a jerk, the light fractured, then nothing but the swing. The drop came, and the world did not end. It merely shifted, heavy and final, as the rope took the weight of a life that had been measured in dumplings and dismissed in court. There was no grand snap, no clean break of the neck that the executioner had prayed for in his silent calculations. Instead, there was the terrible, grinding friction of hemp against flesh, a slow strangulation that turned the air blue with the effort of dying. Eliza's body twisted on the end of the line, a pendulum swinging in the grey draft of Horsemonger Lane, her boots scraping the empty air where the floor had been seconds before. Below, the crowd did not cheer. The roar that had built all morning, a tidal wave of bloodlust and curiosity, collapsed into a murmur that rippled outward from the scaffold like a shockwave of discomfort. They had come for a monster, for a confession wrung from the throat of a poisoner, and they were left watching a girl choke on her own innocence. "Is it done?" someone shouted from the front, a voice cracked with disappointment. "Not yet," another answered, the words dropping flat onto the cobbles. "She still moves." The sheriff stood rigid, his hand gripping the railing until the knuckles bleached white beneath the skin. He stared at the swaying form, at the way the toes curled inside the leather, searching for purchase on nothing. This was not the script. The script demanded a swift drop, an instant stillness, a moral lesson concluded before the tea cooled in the surrounding houses. Instead, they had a spectacle of suffering that offered no resolution, no satisfying closure to the narrative of guilt they had constructed. The silence of the mob was heavier than their shouting had been. It pressed against the ears, a physical weight that made the chest tighten. Men removed their hats, not out of respect, but because the air suddenly felt too thick to breathe under the brim. Women turned their faces away, shielding their children from the sight of a death that refused to be quick. "Cut her down," the sheriff said, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "For God's sake, cut her down." The executioner moved then, clumsy in his sudden haste, climbing the ladder with a haste that betrayed his own shaken nerve. He reached the suspended body, his hands fumbling with the knot that had been tied with such precise malice moments before. The rope groaned under the tension, a wet, fibrous sound that echoed in the quiet yard. When the body finally hit the ground, it did not bounce. It landed with a dull thud, a sack of flour dropped from a height, limbs tangled in the rough wool of the dress. The crowd surged forward, a single organism driven by a new, morbid curiosity. They wanted to see the face. They wanted to see if the guilt was visible now, etched into the features of the dead. But there was no guilt there, only the purple swelling of the throat, the tongue protruding slightly between lips that had spoken nothing but denial. The eyes were open, fixed on the same patch of sky she had claimed in her final moments, seeing nothing now but the indifferent cloud cover. A woman in a shawl reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the hem of Eliza's dress. "She's cold," the woman whispered, pulling her hand back as if burned. "Already cold." "Relics," a man muttered near the gallows, his eyes gleaming with an opportunistic hunger. "The rope, cut a piece of the rope." It began then, the scavenging of a martyr. The executioner stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers, unwilling to intervene as the mob descended upon the remains. They did not treat the body with reverence. They treated it as a source of power, a tangible connection to the injustice they had witnessed. Hands reached out to tear at the linen cap, to snip threads from the dress, to gather the dust that had settled on her shoes. A young apprentice knelt by the head, carefully cutting a lock of hair that had escaped the cap, tucking it into his waistcoat with a reverence that bordered on the religious. Another man produced a knife and sliced a length from the hangman's rope, the frayed ends dangling like dead worms. "Give us a bit," someone shouted, pushing forward. "For the missus. She says it cures the headache." "It cures nothing," an old man spat, though he too held a fragment of hemp in his palm. "It's just blood and bad justice." The body was lifted then, unceremoniously, by two of the turnkeys. They carried her towards the waiting cart, the wheels of which were already sinking into the mud of the yard. There would be no consecrated ground for Eliza Fenning. The church had refused her, just as the court had refused her testimony, just as the masters had refused her humanity. She was to be buried in the unconsecrated pit beyond the wall, alongside the thieves and the vagrants, her name marked only by the number on the register. Yet, as the cart lurched forward, the crowd did not disperse. They followed, a slow, shuffling procession that moved without sound, their feet dragging on the wet stones. They walked not to witness the burial, but to mark the spot, to ensure that the earth knew what lay beneath it. "Where will they put her?" a boy asked, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Where the dogs can't dig," the mother replied, her voice tight. "But we'll know, we'll remember." The cart disappeared through the archway, leaving the scaffold standing empty against the skyline. The trapdoor hung open, a black mouth waiting for the next victim. The sheriff remained on the platform, looking down at the stains on the wood, the dark patches where the life had leaked out. He touched the railing again, feeling the vibration of the departing crowd, a low hum that seemed to resonate in the bones of the gallows themselves. He had done his duty. He had upheld the law. But as he looked out at the sea of hats, at the faces that refused to meet his gaze, he understood that the law had failed. It had killed the girl, yes, but it had not killed the doubt. If anything, the doubt had grown, fed by the silence of the crowd and the stubborn refusal of the dead to confess. A stone struck the side of the scaffold, then another. They were not thrown in anger, but in a strange, ritualistic offering, tapping against the wood like rain. The sheriff flinched, turning towards the sound, but there was no one to blame. The stones came from everywhere and nowhere, a hail of small judgments from the people he had meant to satisfy. He stepped down from the platform, his boots clicking on the wet wood, and walked towards his carriage. The wheels splashed through the puddles, sending muddy water onto the hems of the onlookers, but no one moved to avoid it. They stood their ground, watching him leave, their eyes following the carriage until it turned the corner and vanished into the labyrinth of London streets. In the distance, the bells of a nearby church began to toll, marking the hour. The sound was muffled by the fog rolling in from the river, a dull bronze thrum that seemed to vibrate in the teeth. It was time for dinner, time for the masters to sit down to their roast and their pudding, safe in the knowledge that the poisoner was gone. But as the first spoon was lifted, as the first mouthful of dumpling was prepared to pass the lips, a hesitation would ripple through 1,000 dining rooms. The yeast would rise, the flour would whiten, but the taste would be different now. It would taste of arsenic. It would taste of the girl who died without a confession. The meal would proceed, for hunger is a powerful master, but the silence at the table would be absolute. And in a drawer somewhere, in a house that no longer felt like a home, a letter waited, written in a hand that trembled, inked with a resolve that outlasted the breath. It spoke of innocence. It spoke of a God who saw what the courts could not. It waited for the dust to settle, for the years to pass, for a future voice to break the seal and read the words that Eliza could not speak loud enough to save her life. The ink was dry. The stain was set. The story was over, but the judgment had only just begun. The bolt slid home with a sound like a bone snapping, sharp and final against the roar outside. Robert Turner stood with his back pressed to the oak, his shoulder blades digging into the grain as if he might fuse with the wood itself, become part of the architecture that was supposed to keep the world at bay. He did not move. He barely breathed. The heavy thud of stones against the front of the house vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up the soles of his shoes to rattle his teeth. A relentless, rhythmic pounding that felt less like an assault and more like a heartbeat, slow and angry, belonging to a beast that had swallowed the street whole. "Bar the shutters," he said, his voice cracking on the first syllable, "every one of them." His wife stood in the hallway, her hands clutching the folds of her apron so tightly the knuckles had turned the color of old parchment. She did not look at him. She looked at the door, at the gap beneath it, where the light from the street lamps flickered and died, swallowed by the shadows of the mob. "They are throwing bricks, Robert," she whispered, the words barely audible over the din. "Not stones, bricks." "I said bar them," he snapped, pushing himself away from the door and striding towards the staircase, his boots heavy on the runner. "Do not let a sliver of light show. Do not let them see we are here." He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the exertion sending a hot flush up his neck that had nothing to do with the warmth of the house. The air inside felt thick, cloying, saturated with the scent of beeswax and roasted meat that now sat cold on the sideboard, a meal prepared for a celebration that had curdled into a siege. He reached the landing and paused, listening. The noise outside was not the chaotic screaming of a riot he had expected, the mindless baying of a crowd satisfied by blood. It was lower, deeper, a murmur that swelled and receded like the tide against a crumbling wall, a sound of collective disapproval that seeped through the brickwork and settled in the dust of the carpets. He moved to the window of the drawing room, the place where he had once sat to review his accounts, to plan the expansion of his business, to feel the solid weight of his own authority. Now he crept to the edge of the curtain, pulling the fabric back just an inch, a tiny aperture through which to gauge the enemy. The street below was a churning mass of hats and coats, illuminated by the flickering torches of the watchmen who stood useless at the periphery, their staves held loosely at their sides as if they too were afraid to intervene. A brick sailed through the air, arcing high before smashing into the window frame below, sending a spray of splintered wood and glass onto the pavement. The crowd did not cheer. They did not jeer. They simply watched, 1,000 eyes fixed on the darkened facade of the house, waiting for a sign of life, a crack in the armor. "God help us," his wife said from the doorway, her voice trembling. "They will burn us out. They will burn the whole street." "They will not," Turner said, turning from the window with a force that made the curtain rod shudder. "They are merely rabble. They will tire. They will go home when the bell tolls midnight." "They are not going home, Robert." She took a step into the room, her shadow stretching long and thin across the floorboards. "They are singing." He froze. He had not heard it over the crashing of the bricks, the shouting of names, but now that she mentioned it, the sound rose above the clamor, a low, mournful hymn that drifted up from the throats of men and women who had gathered to witness a death and found instead a mystery they could not solve. It was a psalm, slow and deliberate, the words slurred together, but the intent clear. They were singing for the girl. They were singing against him. "Stop them," he muttered, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Call the watch. Tell them to disperse the crowd." "The watch will not come," she replied, her eyes finally meeting his, wide and hollow. "They are afraid, Robert. They say the magistrate has fled. They say the sheriff will not return." Turner felt a coldness spread through his chest, a sensation distinct from the fear of physical harm, a deeper chill that settled in the marrow of his bones. He walked to the fireplace, where the fire had burned down to a bed of gray ash, the embers glowing faintly like dying eyes. He picked up the poker, the iron cold in his grip, and jabbed at the ashes, sending a cloud of gray dust into the air. It settled on the hearthrug, on his boots, on the hem of his wife's dress, a fine, pervasive layer of grime that seemed to coat everything in the room. "I have done nothing wrong," he said, the words sounding brittle in the heavy air. "I followed the law. I gave my testimony. The court decided." "The court decided," his wife echoed, her voice flat, "but the people do not believe it." He turned on her, the poker raised slightly. a gesture of frustration that made her flinch and step back into the shadows of the hallway. "What would you have me do?" he demanded, his voice rising, echoing off the high ceiling. "Confess to a crime I did not commit, admit to a murder that never happened. Shall I go out there and tell them I lied to save my own skin?" "I would have you keep us alive," she whispered, her hand pressing against the wall as if to steady herself. "I would have you understand that this house is no longer a sanctuary, it is a tomb." He dropped the poker. It clattered against the grate, the sound sharp and metallic, ringing in the silence that followed his outburst. He looked around the room, really looked at it for the first time in days. The portraits on the wall seemed to lean forward, their painted eyes judging him with a severity that matched the crowd below. The furniture, once a symbol of his success, now looked like barricades, heavy and useless against the tide of opinion that was washing over the city. The curtains were drawn, but the light from the torches outside filtered through the gaps, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for him, to pull him towards the window, towards the street, towards the judgment he could not escape. "They will not stop," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Will they?" "No," she answered softly, "not until they have taken everything." He walked back to the window, the urge to look again overpowering his caution. He pulled the curtain aside, wider this time, exposing himself to the gaze of the mob. A stone struck the glass above his head, cracking the pane in a spiderweb pattern that distorted the view of the street below. Through the fracture, he saw faces looking up, pale and upturned, their mouths moving in the song that condemned him. He saw a woman holding a child, pointing at the house, teaching the next generation to hate the name of Turner. He saw a man shaking his fist, not in anger, but in a gesture of sorrow, as if pitying the master who had destroyed himself to save his reputation. The song swelled, louder now, filling the room, vibrating in the floorboards, in the walls, in his own skull. It was a dirge for the dead, but it was also a verdict for the living. He let the curtain fall, blocking out the sight but not the sound. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the things he had worked a lifetime to acquire, and felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life, a man shrinking inside his own clothes, inside his own skin, while the world outside grew larger, more potent, more real than the walls that held him. "Lock the cellar," he said, not turning to face her. "Bring up the wine, we shall not sleep tonight." "There is no wine that will wash this away," she said, her voice devoid of hope. He did not answer. He simply stood there, listening to the singing, waiting for the morning that he knew would bring no relief, only the slow, grinding realization that he had won the trial but lost the war, that his name was now inked in the public ledger alongside the poisoner, bound together in a story that would be told long after the bones of both had turned to dust. The stones continued to fall, a rhythmic tapping on the wood, a countdown to a future he could not control, in a house that was no longer his own. The quill scratched, a dry insect noise against the heavy grain of the paper, the only sound in a room that smelled of damp wool and old iron. Outside, the wind from the Thames pushed a grey fog against the high windows of the Old Bailey archives, blurring the world into a shapeless wash of charcoal and slate. But inside, the air was still, preserved in the amber of procedure. Mr. Halloway did not look up. He never looked up when the final entries were made, for to lift one's eyes was to invite the ghost of the condemned to stand behind the chair, breathing down a neck that had already signed away a life. The inkwell sat open, a small black pool waiting to swallow another name, and he dipped the nib with a precision that bordered on the ceremonial, the steel point gleaming faintly in the candlelight before it touched the surface of the warrant. A drop fell. It landed not on the line prepared for the signature, but slightly to the left, hitting the blank space where the date of birth should have been, and immediately began to spread, a dark, blooming flower of liquid carbon that ate into the fibers of the rag paper. Halloway froze, the quill hovering an inch above the stain, his breath catching in a throat that felt suddenly too tight for the collar of his shirt. He watched the blackness expand, branching out like the roots of a poisonous weed, seeking purchase in the white void, and for a fleeting, irrational second, he imagined it was blood, warm and wet, creeping across the document to mark the hand that held the pen. It was just ink, only ink, yet it possessed a viscosity that water never knew, a heaviness that seemed to pull the page down towards the desk, anchoring the paper to the wood, as if the table itself refused to let the record go. "Damn," he whispered, the word escaping before he could check it, a small profanity that vanished instantly into the thick quiet of the room. He reached for the blotting sand, his movements hurried now, lacking their earlier grace, and shook a generous pile of grey grit over the spill. The sand hissed as it met the wet ink, drinking the moisture but leaving the colour stark and permanent, a scar on the face of the law that no amount of brushing could fully erase. He waited, counting the beats of his own heart, which thudded a dull, irregular rhythm against his ribs, before he swept the excess away with the edge of his hand. The stain remained, a smudge of darkness on the official record of Eliza Fenning, a blemish that would travel with her name into the archives, into the history books, into the minds of those who might one day read this sheet and wonder at the imperfection of the justice it described. It did not matter. The court had spoken. The jury had agreed. The scaffold awaited. A smudge of ink could not overturn a verdict delivered by men in silk wigs, could not bring back the breath that had just left a girl's lungs in the yard at Horsemonger Lane. And yet, as Holloway lifted the quill again to write the final confirmation, his hand trembled just once, a minute vibration that sent a tiny ripple through the fresh line of script. He pressed harder, forcing the letters to be bold, to be certain, to be the absolute truth that the state required them to be. Executed. The word formed under his hand, each letter a nail driven into a coffin that was already closed, the loops of the E and the T twisting together like the rope that had done the work. He leaned back, the wood of the chair creaking under his weight, and surveyed the page. The document was complete. The legal machinery had finished its grinding, reducing a complex tangle of fear, suspicion, kitchen fires, and dumpling dough into a single sheet of foolscap that could be filed away in a drawer and forgotten by Tuesday. The ink was drying, turning from a wet gloss to a matte finish that promised permanence, locking the narrative into a shape that allowed no room for doubt, no space for the questions that were already beginning to circulate in the coffee houses and taverns of the city. He knew, in a distant, academic part of his mind, that there would be pamphlets. There were always pamphlets when the crowd felt uneasy, when the singing started in the streets instead of the jeering. They would argue about the arsenic, about the flour, about the Turners, about the silence of the girl who refused to confess to a sin she claimed she did not commit. But this page did not care for arguments. Paper has no conscience. It holds whatever is written upon it with equal fidelity, whether the words are truth or a convenient lie constructed to soothe the nerves of the master class. Holloway ran a finger along the edge of the document, feeling the rough texture of the stock, the slight raise of the dried ink where the nib had pressed too hard. He thought of the girl, or rather, he thought of the absence of her, the space she had occupied in the dock, and the cell and the cart that was now empty, filled only with the echo of a hymn that had unsettled the hangman. He wondered if she had been afraid. Most were. Most begged, or wept, or collapsed into the arms of the ordinary, seeking a God who seemed remarkably busy with the schedules of the court. But she had walked up those steps with a stillness that felt like an accusation, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the crowd, beyond the gallows, beyond the reach of the law that was now sealing her fate with a stroke of a pen. The stain on the page seemed to darken as he watched it, absorbing the last of the light from the candle. It looked like a finger mark, large and smudged, as if someone had reached out from the other side of the grave to touch the record, to leave a mark that said, "I was here, and I did not do this." Holloway blinked, and the illusion vanished, leaving only a spill of ink on a government form. He stood up, his joints stiff from the long sitting, and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street below, hiding the carriages and the horses and the people who were already dispersing, their hunger for spectacle sated, their minds turning to supper and the warmth of their own homes. They would forget her soon. The city was a beast that consumed its own dead with terrifying speed, digesting tragedy and excreting forgetfulness in a cycle that never stopped. Except for the paper. He turned back to the desk and picked up the warrant, holding it up to the candle flame to inspect the drying script. The light shone through the thin places in the paper, illuminating the fibers, the watermarks, the dark, unyielding letters that spelled out the end of Eliza Fenning. He folded it carefully, aligning the edges with a meticulousness that felt like an apology, and placed it into the leather folder designated for the year's executions. The folder was thick with similar sheets, a catalogue of deaths arranged by date and crime, a library of final moments bound in calf skin and stored on a shelf that gathered dust. He slid the folder into its place, the sound of the leather rubbing against wood loud in the silence, and closed the cabinet door, turning the key with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot. It was done, the record was sealed. The truth, whatever it was now secondary to the written word, buried under layers of procedure and ink and the absolute authority of the Crown. Holloway blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, but the image of that black stain remained in his mind, bright and intrusive, a spot of night that no amount of dawn could wash away. He picked up his hat and coat, moving towards the door with the heavy steps of a man carrying a weight he could not put down, and locked the archive behind him, leaving the girl to her file, her name preserved in the dark, waiting for a future that might one day learn to read between the lines. In a drawer somewhere, far from this room of official lies, a bundle of letters sat wrapped in oilcloth, the paper yellowing, the ink fading, the voice of the dead waiting patiently for someone to listen to the silence she had kept until the end. The Yeast and the Arsenic is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. The case of Eliza Fenning, who was convicted of attempting to poison the family of Mr. Turner by mixing arsenic in yeast, dumplings electronic resource, containing her trial and the particulars of her execution, including several affecting letters written a short time previous to her execution, Internet Archive. Elizabeth Fenning. List of stock characters. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.